There are people who accept the world as it is, and then there are the rare few who refuse, who look at the ordinary and see possibility. Steve Jobs was one of them, a restless thinker, a dreamer who believed that beauty and logic could coexist, and a man who taught the modern world that technology, at its best, is not about machines, it's about humanity. He was not an engineer in the traditional sense. He was a designer of experiences, a conductor of emotion through glass and metal. For Jobs, innovation was not a goal. It was an obsession, a way of seeing, a belief that simplicity could reveal the soul of an idea. In an age when computers were cold and complicated, Steve imagined something warmer. He wanted to make technology invisible, to hide complexity behind elegance. And in doing so, he redefined not just how we use technology, but how we feel about it. Every product, every idea carried a part of his personality, demanding, beautiful, imperfect, and deeply human. But before the world called him a genius, before Apple became a symbol of perfection, there was simply a boy. A boy adopted into a humble family in California who looked at the world with equal parts wonder and defiance. He questioned everything. He distrusted authority. And even as a child, he carried within him a quiet conviction that he was meant to shape something bigger than himself. Jobs was not born into wealth or comfort. He was raised in a small home in Mountain View, surrounded by garages, tools, and the hum of early Silicon Valley. His father, Paul Jobs, taught him the art of craftsmanship, the importance of building things right, even the parts no one could see. That lesson would stay with him forever. From a young age, Steve understood that beauty wasn't decoration. It was discipline. He learned that simplicity is not the absence of detail, but the presence of purpose. When his father showed him how to sand the back of a cabinet, the side that faced the wall, Steve realized that integrity meant caring even when no one else noticed. That belief would later become the invisible foundation of Apple. As he grew older, his mind became both a gift and a challenge. He could see patterns others missed, but he struggled with patience. He wanted to learn, but only on his own terms. Traditional classrooms bored him. Rules felt like walls. He was the kind of student who didn't just ask questions, he asked why the questions existed at all. This defiance wasn't arrogance. It was curiosity turned inward. Jobs was searching for meaning, for connection, for something pure in a world that often felt mechanical. That search would lead him down paths few dared to take, spiritual journeys, artistic experiments, and moments of painful solitude. He didn't just want to make products, he wanted to make things that mattered. In his teenage years, the culture around him was changing. It was the 1960s, a time of rebellion, creativity, and counterculture. Young Steve was drawn to it all, art, music, and the promise that life could be different. He met people who believed in breaking systems, not obeying them. And in that energy, he found himself. But even among rebels, he stood apart. He wasn't just rebelling against authority, he was rebelling against mediocrity. He wanted to fuse technology and poetry, logic and emotion. He believed that the world could be both efficient and beautiful if only someone cared enough to demand it. That demand became his purpose. While others were content to dream, Steve acted. He wasn't satisfied with ideas that lived on paper. He wanted them in his hands, alive, tangible, perfect. Every story about Steve Jobs begins in a garage, but the truth is, it began long before that. It began in the way he saw things. Where others saw numbers, he saw patterns. Where others saw machines, he saw possibilities. He carried within him a quiet vision that would one day change the rhythm of the modern world. Yet that vision came with a cost. His relentless pursuit of perfection would bring both brilliance and conflict. It would lift him to unimaginable heights and later cast him down from the very empire he built. For Steve Jobs, success was never a straight line. It was a spiral of discovery, destruction, and rebirth. And through it all, he never stopped believing, not in luck, not in chance, but in intuition, that small, silent voice inside that told him when something felt right. He trusted it more than logic, more than data, more than the advice of anyone around him. And it was that same intuition that guided Apple through its boldest creations. When you look at the world around you today, at the phone in your hand, the device on your desk, the music that flows seamlessly through your life, you're living in the echo of his imagination. His fingerprints are on every pixel, every design, every interaction that feels simple yet profound. Because simplicity was his rebellion, and beauty was his truth. But this story isn't just about a man who built technology. It's about a man who built belief, a belief that ideas, when pursued with passion and integrity, could change how we see ourselves, a belief that the line between art and engineering was never meant to exist. Steve Jobs wasn't perfect, far from it. He was demanding, volatile, often misunderstood. But beneath the chaos was a kind of clarity that few ever find, the courage to follow a vision that others couldn't yet see. He was, in every sense, a paradox, a dreamer obsessed with precision, a leader who often stood alone, a visionary who never truly stopped seeking. And so, this story isn't about Apple, it's about the man who built it, and the ideas that built him. A boy from Mountain View who turned rebellion into design, failure into wisdom, and simplicity into power. This is not a story about technology. It's a story about humanity, told through the lens of one man's impossible dream. Because in the end, Steve Jobs didn't just change the way we use machines, he changed the way we think. He changed what we expect from the world around us. And perhaps most of all, he reminded us that even in a world full of noise, the quiet pursuit of beauty still matters. Before he was a visionary, Steve Jobs was simply a boy with questions. Born on February 24, 1955 in San Francisco, he entered the world as someone else's secret. His biological parents were young, unready, and uncertain. Within weeks, he was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, an ordinary couple who would raise an extraordinary mind. The Jobs family lived in Mountain View, California, a quiet suburb that would one day become the heart of Silicon Valley. Back then, it was just a stretch of modest homes, apricot orchards, and open skies. Paul Jobs was a mechanic and craftsman who spent hours fixing cars in the family garage. His hands were always dirty, but his work was clean, precise, and full of pride. He believed that if something was worth building, it was worth building right. Steve loved to watch his father work. He studied how Paul lined up every screw, how he smoothed every surface, even the ones no one would ever see. To most, it seemed obsessive. To Steve, it was beautiful. He learned that true craftsmanship wasn't about appearance. It was about integrity. You do it well because it matters, even if no one notices. That idea took root in his mind like a seed. Years later, when engineers at Apple would suggest cutting corners to save time or money, Steve would shake his head and say, "No one will see it, but we will." He was channeling his father's voice, the lesson from that small garage in Mountain View. The back of the cabinet still had to be perfect. As a child, Steve was endlessly curious. He took apart radios, toasters, anything with wires or gears, not because he wanted to destroy them. He wanted to understand them. He wanted to know how things worked, what connected to what, and why. His mother, Clara, encouraged that curiosity. She would sit beside him as he explored, gently reminding him to put everything back together, a reminder he sometimes ignored. But it wasn't just machines that fascinated him. It was the idea of control, of shaping something with precision, of creating order from chaos. That desire would become the foundation of his personality, half artist, half engineer. Even as a boy, he wanted to take messy things and make them simple. School, however, was another story. Steve didn't fit the mold. He was intelligent, yes, but restless. Teachers called him distracted. But he wasn't bored. He was frustrated. He wanted answers that textbooks couldn't give. When a teacher once asked him to color a picture of a house, he asked why the sky always had to be blue. Rules felt arbitrary, creativity felt infinite. And young Steve wanted to push against every limit. He was mischievous, often playing pranks on classmates and teachers. Once he rewired a classroom's alarm system just to see if he could. He could. But underneath the mischief was curiosity, a desire to understand the system, not just break it. That duality, the rebel and the innovator, would follow him for the rest of his life. By the time he reached middle school, his intelligence was undeniable. A teacher named Imogene Hill noticed something different about him, a spark that most kids didn't have. She fed that spark instead of trying to contain it. She challenged him with puzzles, projects, and ideas. Later, Steve would say that if it weren't for her, he might have never survived school. It was the first time someone saw potential where others saw trouble. At home, Paul and Clara nurtured his independence. They didn't spoil him, but they believed in him. Paul once said, "We may not be rich, but we can show him how to think." And that's exactly what they did. Steve learned to value ideas over possessions, curiosity over comfort. The Jobs family may not have had much money, but they had something far more powerful: time, patience, and love. The world around Mountain View was changing fast. Companies like Hewlett-Packard were sprouting nearby, experimenting with new technologies. The hum of innovation filled the air. For a young mind like Steve's, it was electrifying. He would visit the HP campus with his friend Bill Fernandez, staring in awe at the machines and the people who built them. For the first time, he saw a world where ideas could become real. That moment, that feeling, never left him. He wanted to be part of that energy, not just to watch it, but to lead it. By the age of 12, he called Bill Hewlett, co-founder of HP, to ask for spare parts for a school project. Hewlett was so impressed by his confidence that he offered Steve a summer job. It was the first glimpse of the future, a boy from Mountain View walking into the heart of the tech revolution. Those summers changed everything. Steve learned not just how machines worked, but how people thought. He observed engineers, saw how creativity and logic could coexist. It was the first time he realized that innovation wasn't just about circuits. It was about people who dared to imagine differently. He was still just a kid, but his path was already being drawn. Yet, behind the curiosity, there was always restlessness. Steve struggled with identity, a sense of not fully belonging. He knew he was adopted, and though he loved his parents deeply, he carried questions he couldn't always voice. "Who am I?" he would wonder. That quiet introspection, mixed with rebellion, made him feel both special and isolated. It would later shape his drive to prove himself, not just to the world, but to himself. He wasn't content to simply exist within a system. He wanted to bend it, shape it, and reimagine it. Every time he looked at something, a machine, a rule, an idea, he asked the same silent question: could it be better? It was the question that would guide his life, his work, and eventually his revolution. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, Mountain View was no longer just a quiet suburb. It had become the cradle of innovation. Garages turned into workshops, dreams turned into prototypes. And somewhere among those restless young minds, a boy named Steve Jobs was preparing to change the world. He didn't know how yet. He didn't know when. But deep inside, he felt it. That pull, that quiet voice that said, "You're meant to build something that lasts." And in that small house, surrounded by the hum of tools and the smell of metal and oil, the foundation of one of the greatest creative minds in history was being built. Because before Steve Jobs became a visionary, a founder, or a legend, he was simply a boy who looked at the world and refused to accept it as it was. By the time Steve Jobs entered high school, his world was moving faster than he could keep up with. He was surrounded by a generation that wanted to question everything: the government, society, and even the meaning of life itself. But Steve's rebellion was quieter. He wasn't protesting in the streets. He was revolting against boredom, against small ideas, against anything that lacked purpose. He was a thinker who couldn't stop thinking. Teachers saw intelligence in him, but they didn't always know what to do with it. He could grasp complex ideas instantly, yet struggled with patience. When lessons felt too slow, he drifted. When people spoke without depth, he tuned out. He wasn't arrogant. He was simply wired for motion, driven by a curiosity that refused to sleep. At Homestead High School in Cupertino, Steve met people who would shape his life. One of them was Bill Fernandez, a neighbor and fellow tinkerer who introduced him to another brilliant mind, Steve Wozniak. Woz, as everyone called him, was shy, gentle, and utterly fascinated with electronics. He could build anything. And in Woz, Jobs found something he had never seen before, a mirror of his own intensity, but with calm hands and infinite patience. Woz built for fun. Jobs built for meaning. That difference would become their power and their tension for years to come. At school, Steve's restlessness only grew. He'd challenge teachers to explain why things were done a certain way. When they couldn't answer, he'd lose interest. His grades slipped, but his understanding deepened. He wasn't learning through tests. He was learning through experience. He once said, "It's hard to tell what's waste until you look back and realize what mattered." At that time, what mattered to him wasn't memorizing facts, but learning how the world worked. Outside of class, he immersed himself in the culture of the 1970s, a time of freedom, art, and experimentation. He listened to Bob Dylan, read books on philosophy and design, and began exploring the deeper questions of purpose. He wasn't satisfied with how things looked. He wanted to understand why they existed at all. It was a mindset that would later shape every product he ever touched. His curiosity extended into electronics. He and Wozniak spent hours exploring the world of circuits and signals. They scavenged parts, soldered boards, and pushed each other's ideas. One day, Woz showed Jobs a device called the Blue Box, which could mimic telephone tones and make free long-distance calls. To most, it was a prank. To Steve, it was a revelation. He saw something deeper, not the mischief, but the principle behind it. With just a few tones, you could control a massive system. It was the same philosophy that would define Apple years later. A small idea, perfectly executed, could reshape an entire world. He and Woz began building blue boxes to sell, not for money, but for the thrill of creation. It was their first taste of partnership. Woz the engineer, Jobs the visionary. Together, they were unstoppable. It was the first time Steve realized what could happen when technology met bold imagination. At home, his parents watched with cautious pride. They didn't always understand what he was doing, but they trusted his instinct. Paul Jobs, ever the craftsman, reminded his son to take pride in the details. Clara reminded him to stay kind, to stay human. But Steve was already starting to drift inward, a mind too busy to rest, a spirit already searching for something beyond suburban comfort. He read about Zen Buddhism, Hindu philosophy, and the writings of Alan Watts. He began to see design and spirituality as reflections of the same truth: simplicity, purity, essence. To him, technology wasn't cold or mechanical. It could be soulful, it could be art. But this restless search for meaning also made him distant. Friends would describe him as intense, sometimes overwhelming. He could shift from charm to confrontation in an instant. It wasn't intentional. It was the result of a mind constantly in motion, never content with good enough. He wanted life to be elegant, and the world rarely cooperated. As he grew into his late teens, Jobs began exploring new interests: calligraphy, music, and meditation. He started attending the Homebrew Computer Club, a small gathering of hobbyists experimenting with early personal computers. It was there, in that chaotic mix of dreamers and engineers, that Steve felt something ignite inside him. For the first time, he saw people trying to humanize technology. He didn't know it yet, but this community would give him the vision that would change his life. Still, Steve wasn't satisfied with surface-level discovery. He wanted transformation, not just for the world, but for himself. The restlessness that drove him also left him feeling incomplete. He often walked alone through orchards near his home, thinking about life, death, and purpose. There has to be more than this, he'd tell himself. And in that quiet rebellion, the boy from Mountain View began turning into the man who would one day revolutionize design. His curiosity led him to unexpected places. He experimented with diets, fasting, and spiritual retreats. Some saw it as eccentricity. He saw it as exploration. He believed that creativity came from stripping away everything unnecessary until only truth remained. Whether he was building a circuit or searching for enlightenment, the process was the same: reduce, refine, reveal. That obsession with clarity would define the rest of his life. It was the reason he demanded perfection from others, because he demanded it from himself. But in those early years, it also isolated him. Many classmates found him difficult, unpredictable, even cold. Yet, there was something magnetic about him. People sensed that he saw the world differently. He didn't follow the map. He wanted to redraw it. At 17, Jobs graduated high school with little direction, but infinite potential. College didn't seem appealing. Rules, schedules, and requirements were the same walls he'd been climbing his entire life. Yet deep down, he knew he needed new experiences, something to challenge his mind and quiet his spirit. He wanted to find a place where he could think freely, without limits. That search would take him far from home to Reed College in Oregon. It was a small liberal arts school known for creativity and chaos, a place where thinkers and misfits collided. Steve didn't know what he'd find there, but he knew he needed to go. His parents, despite their modest income, supported him completely. They had no idea that this next step would lead their son toward the very ideas that would shape Apple's soul. As he packed his things, Paul Jobs handed him a small set of tools, the same ones he'd used to teach Steve the value of precision. "Whatever you build," his father said, "make sure it's built right." Steve nodded quietly. He didn't realize it then, but that simple advice would echo through every creation he touched. The restless mind of a California boy was now setting out into the wider world, a world of art, thought, rebellion, and discovery. He was leaving Mountain View behind, but carrying its lessons with him: care about the unseen, think differently, and never settle for what already exists. He didn't know it yet, but the next chapter of his life would push him to question not just how to build things, but why they should be built at all. Because for Steve Jobs, life was never about following instructions. It was about finding the beauty hidden between them. When Steve Jobs arrived at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, he carried almost nothing but his curiosity. The campus was unlike any place he had ever seen: chaotic, artistic, and alive with ideas. Students roamed barefoot through hallways filled with poetry and protest. It wasn't just a college. It was a laboratory for thought, a place where rebellion and creativity lived side by side. But even here, structure felt too heavy for him. After a single semester, he dropped out, not because he was lazy, but because he wanted to choose his own education. He began auditing the classes that inspired him, sleeping on friends' floors, and collecting bottles for spare change. He lived on little, but learned endlessly. In a world obsessed with results, Steve was searching for meaning. One class changed everything. It was a course in calligraphy taught by a professor named Robert Palladino. The room was quiet, filled with the smell of ink and the soft scratch of pens on paper. Palladino spoke not about letters, but about artistry. He taught that space, rhythm, and proportion could express emotion. To Steve, it was revelation. The idea that design could speak without words, that beauty could be functional, became a core belief that would one day define Apple. He didn't know it then, but that single decision, to follow curiosity instead of convention, would shape how the world interacts with technology. Years later, when the first Macintosh computer introduced elegant fonts and typography, Steve would recall that class at Reed. "If I hadn't dropped in on that calligraphy course," he once said, "the Mac would never have had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts." Reed was his education in simplicity, not the kind taught by textbooks, but the kind revealed by experience. He learned that minimalism wasn't emptiness. It was precision. It was removing everything unnecessary until only truth remained. That philosophy would stay with him forever, from the way Apple designed its products to the way he tried to live his life. But beyond art and design, Reed College introduced him to a deeper kind of exploration, the inner one. Steve began reading about Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, and the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. He experimented with fasting, meditation, and silence. To outsiders it seemed strange, even extreme, but to Steve it was essential. He was stripping away distractions, searching for stillness in a noisy world. He would later describe this period as one of both chaos and clarity. "If you just sit and observe," he said, "you'll see how restless your mind is, but when it calms, you see more clearly." That belief, that clarity leads to creation, became his secret weapon. It guided him not only in spirituality but also in business, design, and leadership. Jobs began wearing simple clothes, walking barefoot across campus lawns, and attending spiritual lectures. His friends found him unpredictable, sometimes deeply focused, other times lost in thought for hours. He wasn't chasing comfort, he was chasing essence. He wanted to understand what truly mattered. Money didn't matter. Status didn't matter. What mattered was creating something pure, something that felt right. That sense of rightness, that deep intuition, became his moral compass. It wasn't logical, but it was powerful. When asked years later how he made decisions, he often smiled and said, "I just feel it." That was the Zen within him, the simplicity of trusting instinct. Yet simplicity didn't mean softness. His pursuit of truth made him demanding, sometimes harsh. When he saw something fake or half-hearted, he rejected it instantly. Why would anyone settle for average, he'd ask. He wasn't trying to be difficult, he was trying to protect something sacred, the purity of vision. During his time at Reed, he met people who would influence him for life. Artists, philosophers, and engineers alike shared ideas late into the night, exploring the boundaries between art and science. The conversations often drifted towards a single question: what makes something meaningful? For Steve, the answer was becoming clearer. Meaning comes from simplicity, and simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. That phrase, borrowed from Leonardo da Vinci, would later hang in Apple's early marketing campaigns. It wasn't just a slogan, it was the core of Steve's philosophy. Every product, every design, every presentation he gave was built on that belief. To him, technology wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to disappear, leaving only experience behind. But in those early days at Reed, he wasn't building computers. He was building perspective. He was learning how to see. That was his real education, not in programming, but in perception. He was training his mind to notice the spaces between things, to sense flow, balance, and emotion. Years later, when he would describe design as how it works, not how it looks, he was echoing the lessons he learned here. Eventually, life at Reed became unsustainable. He had no money, no dorm, and no clear direction. He collected Coke bottles for recycling to buy food and walked 7 miles every Sunday night to get a free meal at the Hare Krishna temple. But he was never bitter. He often said it was one of the most creative times of his life. Poverty had freed him from pressure. Simplicity had become both necessity and teacher. It was around this time that his fascination with the East deepened. He read books on Zen philosophy, spent time with Buddhist monks, and even planned a pilgrimage to India. He wanted to experience enlightenment firsthand, not as an idea, but as a state of being. He believed that to create something truly great, one had to understand life itself. And for him, understanding began with silence. In 1974, after leaving Reed, Steve returned briefly to California to work at Atari, a young video game company that valued creativity over convention. There, his eccentric habits continued. He walked barefoot in the office, argued passionately about design, and insisted that simplicity made everything better. Even then, his co-workers could see he was different, sharp, focused, intense. They didn't know it yet, but they were working alongside a man who would one day redefine how the world connected to machines. His time at Atari was short, but it gave him something more valuable than a paycheck: clarity. Surrounded by the hum of circuits and screens, he realized he didn't want to just work with technology. He wanted to transform it. He wanted to make machines that didn't just function, but felt human. And to understand humanity, he believed he had to go somewhere even deeper into himself. So he followed his instinct to India. He sold his few possessions, packed a small bag, and set out on a journey that would change him forever. He wasn't searching for success. He was searching for truth. He wanted to know why things exist, why people suffer, why beauty matters. He didn't find every answer, but he found something far more powerful: perspective. In India, he learned that truth doesn't shout, it whispers. It lives in stillness, in humility, in the way light falls on simple things. When he returned to California months later, he wasn't a different person, just a clearer one. He spoke less, listened more, and carried a quiet confidence that came from knowing what truly matters. That quietness would become his greatest strength. Because when the noise of business, competition, and doubt surrounded him in later years, he always returned to that still place within, the one he had found walking barefoot across the fields of reed and the temples of India. Steve Jobs had gone searching for simplicity, and he had found it not in wealth, not in comfort, but in clarity. He understood now that simplicity was not a design choice, it was a way of life. And that belief that what's simple is powerful would soon lead him back home to California, where another restless mind, Steve Wozniak, was waiting in a small garage filled with possibility. When Steve Jobs returned from India in 1974, he carried with him not souvenirs, but stillness. His friends noticed it immediately. The once restless young man had become quieter, more deliberate. He had tasted simplicity in its purest form and wanted to bring that same purity into everything he touched. But the world he was returning to was changing fast. Silicon Valley was no longer just a place. It was becoming an idea, a revolution built from code, silicon, and impossible dreams. The energy of innovation was everywhere. Garages were turning into laboratories. Teenagers were building circuits that could change industries. It was a time when the line between genius and madness barely existed, and in the midst of it all, Steve reconnected with an old friend, Steve Wozniak, the quiet engineering wizard who had once built blue boxes with him. Woz was working at Hewlett-Packard, spending his nights tinkering with circuit boards and his days imagining a new kind of computer, not a massive machine meant for corporations, but something personal, something people could touch, use, and love. When Jobs saw Woz's latest prototype, a small board that could display text on a screen, he felt a spark that had been waiting to ignite. To most people, it looked like a toy. To Steve, it looked like the future. He leaned forward, eyes wide, and said, "We could sell this." Woz laughed at first. He wasn't interested in business. He built things because it was fun. But Jobs saw what Woz didn't: a world ready for change. A world waiting for technology that belonged to everyone, not just scientists in labs. That night, under the warm glow of a single desk lamp, the idea for Apple Computer was born. It began in the Jobs family garage, a small, cluttered space that would one day become one of the most famous addresses in history. 2066 Crist Drive, Los Altos. Paul Jobs cleared space on the workbench while Clara brought snacks and encouragement. The two young men, barely in their 20s, began soldering parts, assembling boards, and dreaming of a company that could make computers for the rest of us. Wozniak handled the engineering, wires, chips, resistors, while Jobs handled the vision. He thought about color, form, packaging, and the story they were telling. "We're not selling a product," he said. "We're selling a revolution." To him, Apple wasn't just a business. It was a movement, a chance to humanize technology and merge art with engineering. The first prototype, the Apple I, was built almost entirely by hand. Woz's brilliance made it elegant and efficient, while Steve's insistence on perfection made it beautiful. They sold a few units to a local computer store called The Byte Shop, earning just enough money to build more. For the first time, the world was seeing what would become Apple's trademark: technology that felt alive. Jobs' charisma began to attract others. Friends like Ronald Wayne, a former Atari colleague, helped draft the first partnership agreement. Wayne, however, left early, selling his 10% stake for just $800, a decision that would later become one of the most famous regrets in business history. But the foundation had been laid. Apple wasn't just two dreamers in a garage anymore. It was a company with purpose. As Apple I gained attention, Jobs became obsessed with making something better, something simpler, cleaner, and more accessible. He believed the computer could be a household object, as common as a typewriter or television. It was a radical idea for its time. When most companies were building massive machines for businesses, Jobs wanted to put power in the hands of ordinary people. To bring that vision to life, he needed funding. So, dressed in his best shirt, he walked into Mike Markkula's home, a retired Intel executive and investor. Jobs spoke not with numbers, but with conviction. He talked about changing lives, about the intersection of art and science. Markkula saw what many couldn't, the rare combination of vision and drive. He invested $250,000 and became Apple's first major backer. With that investment, Apple was officially incorporated in 1976. The garage became a factory, the dream became a company, and the company began to grow faster than anyone imagined. Woz designed, Jobs evangelized, and together they built something that felt inevitable: a personal computer designed with the soul of an artist and the precision of an engineer. The Apple II was their masterpiece. Sleek, colorful, and user-friendly, it was unlike anything the market had seen. While other computers were gray boxes filled with intimidating switches, Apple II was approachable, almost friendly. It invited you in. Schools, hobbyists, and families began buying it in droves. Within a few years, Apple's revenue soared from thousands to millions. The dream born in a garage had become a phenomenon, but success came with its own storms. As Apple grew, so did Steve's intensity. He demanded impossible standards, not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. He believed that the smallest detail could change everything. "Real artists ship," he told his team. "Great design isn't just how it looks, it's how it works." Those words became Apple's internal creed, shaping everything they built. Employees admired and feared him. He could walk into a room and change the energy instantly. His passion inspired, but his perfectionism exhausted. Some said he was impossible to please. Others said that was exactly what made him great. He had learned from his father that the back of a cabinet, the part no one sees, should be crafted as beautifully as the front. And now he demanded that same integrity from everyone at Apple. The company's rise was meteoric. By the time Apple went public in 1980, it had turned hundreds of young engineers into millionaires overnight. Newspapers called it a miracle. Steve Jobs, just 25 years old, was suddenly one of the richest men in America. Yet behind his quiet smile, he wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about what came next. He saw technology not as a tool, but as an extension of human potential. And he wasn't content to stop with success. He wanted to redefine the relationship between humans and machines, to make technology feel natural, invisible, and deeply personal. But to do that, he would need something more than ambition. He would need a new kind of vision. That vision would soon lead him to an ambitious project, one that would combine art, science, and rebellion in ways the world had never seen. A project that would test his leadership, his patience, and his soul. It would be called the Macintosh. By the early 1980s, Apple had become a symbol of possibility. The Apple II was a global success. Classrooms across America buzzed with the sound of its keys, and Steve Jobs was no longer just a young entrepreneur. He was the face of a movement. But success never satisfied him for long. He wasn't content with what Apple had achieved. He wanted to change not just what computers could do, but how they made people feel. He dreamed of something smaller, simpler, and more human. A computer that anyone could use, not just hobbyists and experts. He wanted it to be intuitive, beautiful, and deeply personal. He wanted it to speak the language of the soul, not the syntax of machines. That dream would become the Macintosh, but the road to creating it would test every part of who he was. Inside Apple, there were two competing projects: the Lisa, a powerful computer aimed at businesses, and the Macintosh, a smaller experimental project started by Jeff Raskin, a quiet engineer who believed in affordable simplicity. Jobs, initially removed from the Lisa project after clashing with management, began gravitating toward the Macintosh team. He saw in it what he had always sought: purity, clarity, rebellion. When he joined the team, everything changed. The small group of engineers suddenly found themselves swept into the orbit of Steve's intensity. He pushed them harder than they had ever imagined possible. Deadlines became dreams. Sleep became optional. But something magical began to happen. They started believing, truly believing, that they were building the future. He called them artists. He told them they were not just engineers, but creators of history. He drew a pirate flag over their lab and hung it proudly, declaring, "It's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy." It wasn't just a slogan. It was a mindset. The Macintosh team became a band of rebels inside their own company, breaking rules, rewriting them, and inventing a new way of thinking. Jobs demanded perfection. Every curve, every color, every sound had to feel right. He would stare at prototypes for hours, adjusting shades by a single tone, testing fonts, obsessing over how the computer breathed. He wanted it to greet people warmly, to feel alive when it turned on. The engineers thought he was being unreasonable, until they saw what he saw. For Steve, design was not decoration. It was storytelling. He believed every product should tell a story the moment you saw it, a story of clarity, empathy, and purpose. He often said, "People don't know what they want until you show it to them." And the Macintosh, in his mind, would show the world what technology could become when love met logic. In 1983, Jobs found the perfect ally for this vision: John Sculley, the successful CEO of Pepsi. Jobs convinced him to leave the world of soft drinks for the world of dreams, famously asking, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Sculley said yes, and for a brief moment, their partnership seemed destined for greatness. As the Macintosh neared completion, anticipation grew. But so did tension. Jobs' relentless drive created friction within the team. His emotional extremes, moments of warmth followed by bursts of fury, left some inspired and others exhausted. Yet despite the chaos, the machine was taking shape. It was beautiful. It was bold. It was everything he imagined. The launch of the Macintosh in 1984 was unlike anything the tech world had ever seen. Apple unveiled it with a legendary commercial directed by Ridley Scott, inspired by George Orwell's 1984. It depicted a lone runner smashing the screen of conformity, declaring the dawn of freedom and individuality. The message was clear. Apple was not just selling computers. It was declaring war on mediocrity. When Jobs stood on stage to introduce the Macintosh, his hands trembled slightly as he unveiled the small beige box. He turned it on, and the screen came to life. A friendly digital voice greeted the audience. "Hello, I'm Macintosh." The crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't just a product launch, it was a moment of history. The Macintosh represented everything Jobs stood for: simplicity, humanity, and rebellion. It was a work of art wrapped in technology. But beneath the cheers and headlines, trouble was already brewing. The computer, though revolutionary, was expensive and limited in performance. Sales began to fall short of expectations, and within Apple's walls, whispers of doubt began to grow louder. John Sculley, the man Jobs had brought in, began questioning his leadership. The board, once enchanted by Steve's charisma, grew concerned by his unpredictability. His brilliance was undeniable, but so was his volatility. Apple had outgrown the garage, and perhaps it had outgrown him. Steve didn't see it that way. He believed Apple's soul was its creativity, its willingness to defy logic for beauty. He warned that chasing numbers instead of meaning would destroy the company. But business is rarely a place for poets. Meetings turned cold. Decisions turned political, and by 1985 the unthinkable happened. Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he had built. When he left Apple, he was just 30 years old. The newspapers called it poetic justice, the fall of a boy genius. But for Steve, it was heartbreak. He had poured his spirit into a dream that now belonged to others. For the first time since his teenage years, he found himself without direction, stripped of title, company, and purpose. He could have disappeared. He could have lived comfortably, a wealthy man, at peace with his legacy. But peace was never what he wanted. He didn't build for comfort. He built for meaning. And somewhere deep inside, he knew his story wasn't finished yet. The fall of Steve Jobs was not the end. It was the silence before the second act, the part of every great story where loss turns into wisdom. Because sometimes to rediscover your purpose, the world has to take everything away from you first. When Steve Jobs walked out of Apple in 1985, he carried nothing but his conviction. The boardroom that once echoed with his ideas had turned silent to his voice. The company he built, the dream he had poured his youth into, was now moving on without him. For the first time in his life, Steve felt the stillness of failure, a kind of quiet that was heavier than noise. He was only 30 years old, but the world saw him as finished. Reporters called him a fallen visionary, an arrogant leader who flew too close to the sun. Some said Apple was better off without him. But behind that public humiliation, something was burning brighter than ever. Beneath the ashes of loss, Steve found a new kind of clarity, the fire within. He retreated from the spotlight, but not from creation. He still believed in the power of technology to change the world, only now he wanted to rebuild it from the ground up. That same year, he founded a new company, Next Inc. It wasn't just a business to him, it was a statement. If Apple wouldn't let him build the future, he would build it elsewhere. The idea behind Next was ambitious, to create powerful, beautifully designed computers for universities and scientists. Steve wanted to merge art and academia, to give thinkers tools that matched the sophistication of their ideas. But doing that meant starting over, New offices, new engineers, new battles. He was no longer the young prodigy of Silicon Valley. He was an exile, fighting to prove that his vision still mattered. Money wasn't a problem. He sold his Apple shares and invested tens of millions into Next. But money couldn't buy what he had lost: the magic of a loyal team, the momentum of a movement. Many who joined him admired his drive, but feared his perfectionism. Steve demanded the impossible, and Next quickly became known for its elegant prototypes and expensive delays. Still, the product that emerged was extraordinary. The Next computer, released in 1988, was ahead of its time, sleek, minimalist, and built with revolutionary software. It was beautiful to look at, but its price made it inaccessible to most buyers. Once again, Steve had created brilliance that few could afford. But even in commercial struggle, Next was quietly changing history. The Next operating system would later become the foundation of Mac OS X, and its object-oriented design influenced generations of software developers. One of Next's computers was even used by Tim Berners-Lee to build the first version of the World Wide Web. Steve didn't know it then, but his failure was quietly shaping the Internet age. Yet, during those years in exile, something deeper was changing inside him. The young man who once demanded perfection began to understand patience. The boy who once chased success began to question its meaning. He often reflected on his mistakes at Apple: the impatience, the ego, the inability to listen. "I had to learn to see through other people's eyes," he later said. "You can't do great work alone." It was during this time that another part of his life began to take shape, a part that had nothing to do with machines or markets. In 1986, he bought a small computer graphics division from filmmaker George Lucas. It was called the Graphics Group, but Steve renamed it Pixar. At first, it was just an experiment, a side project, but what it became would change not only his life, but the entire world of entertainment. Pixar was a company filled with dreamers, animators, artists, and engineers who believed computers could create emotion, not just imagery. Steve didn't always understand animation, but he understood vision. He gave them time, funding, and most importantly, belief. For years, the studio struggled financially, but he refused to let it die. "If something feels right," he would say, "you keep going, even when no one else sees it." That faith paid off in 1995 when Pixar released its first full-length feature film, Toy Story. It was the world's first entirely computer-animated movie, and a masterpiece. The film became a cultural phenomenon, breaking records and redefining what animation could be. For Steve, it wasn't just a business victory. It was proof that technology could touch the heart. Pixar's success restored something he had lost: confidence. The world began to see him not as the man who failed at Apple, but as the visionary who built two revolutions. And yet, through all the triumph, he remained introspective. "I used to think being right was everything," he said in an interview. "Now I think it's about being true." Meanwhile, Apple was struggling. Without Jobs' guiding hand, the company had lost its direction. Its products were scattered, its vision blurred. The very company that had once changed the world was now falling behind. By the mid-1990s, Apple was on the brink of collapse, and in a twist of destiny, the company that had exiled him was about to call him home. In 1996, Apple made a bold decision to acquire Next for $429 million. The deal wasn't just about technology. It was about bringing Steve Jobs back. When he walked into Apple's headquarters for the first time in over a decade, the energy shifted. The same walls that once rejected him now seemed to whisper his name. He returned not as the impulsive young visionary who had once tried to conquer the world, but as a man transformed by failure, fatherhood, and reflection. He was calmer, sharper, and more focused. He had learned that leadership wasn't about control. It was about clarity. "You can't connect the dots looking forward," he said. You can only connect them looking backward. The dots, it seemed, had connected perfectly. His exile had given him the perspective Apple needed to survive. The ideas born at Next, its software architecture, its design philosophy, its simplicity, would become the foundation of Apple's rebirth. When he returned as interim CEO in 1997, Steve Jobs stood before his employees and said, "We're going to make Apple great again." There was no arrogance in his tone, only conviction. The fire that had once burned recklessly now burned with purpose. He wasn't coming back for revenge. He was coming back for redemption. Because Steve Jobs understood something few ever learn, that failure, when faced with humility, becomes fuel. It burns away ego and leaves only truth. And truth, when followed with faith, can rebuild empires. As the sun set behind the glass walls of Apple's campus that evening, Steve looked out at the company he had created and lost, and now returned to save. His journey had come full circle. The boy who had dreamed in a garage was back, not to repeat the past but to redefine the future. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company was on life support. Once a symbol of innovation, it had become tangled in confusion. Too many products, too many ideas, no clear direction. The world had moved on, and Apple was fading into irrelevance. Most analysts predicted its collapse within a year. But Steve didn't see failure when he walked through those glass doors again. He saw potential, sleeping, buried, waiting for light. He was older now, calmer, sharper. The chaos that once fueled him had become focus. He spoke quietly, but every word carried gravity. He knew that Apple didn't just need new products, it needed a new soul, and he was ready to give it one. His first move was radical simplicity. He gathered his top executives into a room and drew a simple grid on a whiteboard. Across the top he wrote consumer and professional. Down the side he wrote desktop and portable. 4 squares. "This is it," he said. 4 great products, that's all Apple needs. It was more than a strategy, it was a philosophy. Clarity over chaos, focus over frenzy. He shut down dozens of projects, canceled unnecessary products, and told his teams to start thinking differently again. The new Apple wouldn't compete by being louder. It would win by being clear, elegant, and meaningful. Then, in a twist that few expected, Steve reached out to an old rival, Bill Gates. Apple and Microsoft had spent years battling each other, each painting the other as the enemy. But Steve understood something that pride often hides, that survival sometimes requires humility. In a surprise announcement, he revealed that Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple. The audience at Macworld booed. Steve smiled. "We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose." It was a masterclass in leadership, calm, pragmatic, visionary. With stability secured, he turned his attention to design, his true language. He brought back Jony Ive, a young British designer whose clean, minimalist style resonated with his own Zen sensibilities. Together, they began reimagining what Apple could be. Steve wanted the company to rediscover its heart, not just to build machines, but to craft experiences that felt alive. The first symbol of this rebirth came in 1998, the iMac. It was unlike any computer the world had ever seen. Translucent, colorful, inviting. It looked less like a machine and more like a piece of modern art. The iMac wasn't just designed to be used, it was designed to be loved. "It's the computer for the rest of us," Steve said, echoing the same dream he'd had in that garage 2 decades earlier. The iMac was a sensation. It didn't just save Apple, it redefined it. Sales skyrocketed, the company's image transformed overnight, and a new era had begun. But for Steve, it wasn't just about numbers, it was about proving a deeper truth. That simplicity, when done right, is revolutionary. He started rebuilding Apple's culture from within. Meetings became meditations on purpose. Every design was questioned, not for what it did, but for why it existed. He encouraged his teams to care about the unseen, the hidden details. Design is not just what it looks like, he reminded them, it's how it works. Those words became the heartbeat of Apple's rebirth. His perfectionism returned, but this time it was guided by wisdom. He no longer shouted to be heard. He listened, then decided. He could still be fierce, still demand the impossible, but there was a new rhythm to his leadership. The fire that once burned recklessly had become light, steady, focused, illuminating everything it touched. He surrounded himself with people who shared that light. Johnny Ive designed with empathy. Tim Cook managed with precision. Phil Schiller marketed with passion. Together they became the backbone of the new Apple, a company not driven by products, but by philosophy. And then Steve did what he had always done best. He began to think ahead. The iMac was only the beginning. He saw a future where Apple wasn't just a computer company, but a lifestyle brand, one that merged technology with emotion, design with humanity. He envisioned devices that fit seamlessly into people's lives, tools that felt personal, intuitive, and alive. In 2001, Apple unveiled a small white device that would change everything again, the iPod. 1,000 songs in your pocket, Steve said, holding it in the palm of his hand. The audience gasped. Music was no longer bound by CDs or cluttered shelves. It was simple, portable, and pure. The iPod wasn't just a product, it was liberation. This was the new Apple, elegant, emotional, essential. But behind the calm exterior, Steve's health was quietly beginning to decline. In 2003, he was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. He told almost no one at first. To the world, he remained the tireless visionary, thin, energetic, smiling under the stage lights. Inside, he was learning the hardest lesson of all. That time, even for geniuses, is finite. Yet illness did not slow him. If anything, it sharpened him. He became even more focused, more deliberate. Every keynote, every product, every decision carried a sense of urgency, as if he knew the clock was ticking. Remembering that I'll be dead soon, he later said, is the most important tool I've ever encountered, because almost everything, all pride, all fear, all embarrassment, just falls away in the face of death. He wasn't just rebuilding Apple anymore. He was building a legacy. By the mid-2000s, Apple had become the embodiment of simplicity and beauty. The iMac had evolved. The iPod had conquered. And in secret, Steve and his team were preparing something even greater, a device that would unite everything he had ever learned about design, technology, and humanity. He called it Project Purple. The world would later call it the iPhone. By the mid-2000s, Apple had become more than a company. It was a movement. The iMac had redefined the home computer, and the iPod had reshaped how the world experienced music. Millions of people were walking through life with Apple's white earbuds, carrying their own soundtracks. Apple was no longer just selling products. It was selling identity, the feeling of being part of something different, something human, in a digital world. But for Steve Jobs, this was only the beginning. He had always seen technology as an extension of life itself, not something cold or distant, but something that could connect, inspire, and empower. And he knew that the next great leap wouldn't come from computers or music players. It would come from the device people already carried with them everywhere, the phone. At the time, phones were clunky, cluttered, and uninspired. Each one was packed with buttons, menus, and features no one used. Steve saw the problem immediately. Complexity had replaced clarity. He believed that the future of technology wasn't about adding more, but removing everything unnecessary until only the essence remained. He wanted to reinvent the phone to create something simple, beautiful, and intuitive, something that would feel like magic. So in secret, behind locked doors and under code names, a small team began working on what Apple called Project Purple. The idea was bold: combine a phone, a music player, and an internet communicator into one device. To most engineers, it sounded impossible. But Steve didn't believe in impossible. He believed in inevitable, if you had the courage to focus. The team worked in near-total secrecy for years. Steve visited their lab daily, walking barefoot across the floor, examining prototypes, pushing everyone to think differently. He obsessed over every curve, every animation, every click. He wanted it to feel alive, not like a gadget, but like a living thing that responded to touch, emotion, and intuition. He once told the designers, "It should feel like it came from another planet, but one that understands us." The moment of revelation came in January 2007, on the stage of the Macworld Conference in San Francisco. Steve Jobs, dressed in his signature black turtleneck and jeans, stood before a sea of eager faces. "Today," he began, "we're introducing 3 revolutionary products." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator." The crowd applauded. Then he smiled. "Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device." The screen behind him lit up with a single word: iPhone. The room erupted. It was a moment that would be replayed for decades, the unveiling of a device that would redefine modern life. The iPhone wasn't just a product. It was the birth of a new world. It replaced buttons with touch, complexity with elegance, confusion with clarity. It felt personal, intimate even. You didn't use it. You interacted with it. For Steve, this was the culmination of everything he'd ever believed. From the simplicity of Zen to the elegance of calligraphy, from the garage in Los Altos to the stage in San Francisco, it all led here. He had finally merged art and technology so seamlessly that the distinction no longer mattered. The iPhone wasn't just beautiful, it was human. The success was immediate. People lined up outside Apple stores for days, eager to hold the future in their hands. Within months, the iPhone had transformed Apple from a computer company into a global cultural force. Every industry, phones, music, media, even photography, was suddenly forced to adapt to the new standard Steve had set. But as the world celebrated, Steve kept pushing forward. He didn't believe in standing still. "Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower," he often said. And Apple, under his guidance, would lead relentlessly. The App Store, introduced in 2008, opened a universe of creativity. Developers around the world could now build and share ideas instantly. The iPhone had become not just a device, but a platform, a living ecosystem that connected human imagination on a global scale. Every year, the iPhone evolved, thinner, faster, more capable. Yet Steve's focus never changed. He wasn't interested in specs or numbers. He cared about experience, how it felt in the hand, how it sounded when you touched it, how it made life simpler, not more complicated. He often told his team, "Design is about empathy. You have to start with the customer experience and work backward to the technology." The iRevolution, as the media began calling it, wasn't just technological. It was philosophical. It reminded the world that true innovation begins with understanding, not what machines can do, but what people need. It was the same belief that guided him from the beginning. Simplicity is not the absence of complexity, but the presence of purpose. And yet, behind the glow of success, his body was quietly failing him. The cancer that had been dormant had returned. By 2009, his frame grew thinner, his movements slower. He continued to lead, to dream, to push. But each keynote now carried a sense of fragility. The audience didn't just see a CEO anymore. They saw a man racing against time. But Steve never let illness define him. "Your time is limited," he said in one of his most famous speeches, "so don't waste it living someone else's life." He spoke those words to students at Stanford University in 2005, sharing his story of failure, loss, and rebirth. He told them that death was life's greatest invention, a force that clears the old to make way for the new. Few realized as he spoke how personally those words applied to him. The iPhone had made him immortal in the eyes of the world, but Steve Jobs never saw himself as a god of technology. He saw himself as a craftsman, shaping something larger than himself. Each new product, each new idea, was his way of leaving behind a piece of what he believed, that the intersection of technology and liberal arts could reveal the very best of humanity. By 2010, he introduced the iPad, another device that blurred boundaries and reshaped industries. It was thin, quiet, and powerful, a glass canvas for thought. Critics mocked it at first. "Who needs a giant iPhone?" they laughed. But Steve knew better. He understood that great ideas are often misunderstood at birth. And when the world caught up, as it always did, Apple once again stood at the center of innovation. The iRevolution was complete. Apple wasn't just creating products anymore, it was shaping culture, communication, and even consciousness. People worked, learned, created, and connected differently because of what Steve and his team had built. Technology had become invisible, and that, to him, was the ultimate success. But as Apple reached its greatest heights, Steve's body began to surrender. Each public appearance grew rarer, each smile thinner, and yet, even in weakness, his presence remained electric. He would walk on stage, pale and trembling, but when he spoke, his voice still carried the same warmth and conviction it always had. In private, he knew his time was running out, but he wasn't afraid. He had built something that would outlast him, not just a company, but a philosophy. Apple was now guided by a simple truth he had spent his life proving, that great design is not about technology, it's about humanity. And as the world prepared for his final curtain, Steve Jobs was already thinking about what came next, not in business, but in legacy. Because revolutions don't end when their leaders fade. They continue, quietly, in every person who dares to think differently. By 2011, the glow of Apple's success illuminated the entire world. The iPhone had redefined communication, the iPad was changing education, and Apple had become the most valuable company on Earth. Yet inside the man who built it all, a quiet battle was being fought. Steve Jobs, the visionary who had once seemed unstoppable, was running out of time. His illness had returned, this time with no mercy. The same mind that had tamed technology now faced a challenge it couldn't outthink or outdesign. Friends and colleagues saw him grow thinner, his movements slower, his voice softer. But his eyes, those sharp, focused eyes, never lost their fire. They still carried the light of ideas that had yet to be born. He continued to work through pain, often from his home in Palo Alto. Meetings were moved to his living room. Prototypes sat beside medical charts. He would look at designs, tweak presentations, and talk about the future as if nothing had changed. Those around him realized that Steve was no longer building products. He was building eternity. Even as his health declined, his imagination soared. He began shaping what he saw as the next great evolution of Apple. The Apple Park campus, a circular glass-walled structure he described as a spaceship landed in an orchard. He wanted it to feel organic, filled with trees, light, and space, a reflection of the values he cherished: simplicity, nature, and human connection. It would be, in many ways, his final masterpiece. He also dreamed of a future beyond devices, a seamless world where technology would fade quietly into daily life. The best technology, he once said, is invisible. He envisioned a time when design would merge so completely with experience that people would no longer notice the machine, only the moment. It was a thought born from a lifetime of stripping away the unnecessary, revealing only the essence. In his final months, Steve spoke often about life, death, and legacy. He told his biographer, Walter Isaacson, that he didn't believe in dogma, but in intuition, that some things could be felt even if they couldn't be proved. "I like to think that something survives when we die," he said softly. "It's too beautiful to just disappear." Those words revealed the spiritual calm he had been searching for since his youth, the peace that came from understanding that creation never truly ends. At Apple's headquarters, his team continued to bring his last visions to life. The next generation of iPhones, iPads, and software were all shaped by his guidance. Even when he couldn't attend meetings, his influence was everywhere. His standards, his sense of beauty, his quiet insistence that technology should just work, they had become part of Apple's DNA. In August 2011, Steve Jobs officially stepped down as Apple's CEO. The letter he wrote was simple, almost poetic. "I have always said, if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come." He signed it with gratitude and with faith in the team he had built. He passed the torch to Tim Cook, a man he trusted deeply. Cook had stood beside him for years, quietly guiding operations, ensuring Apple ran with precision and grace. Steve once said, "Tim's not me," but he never had to be. What mattered most to him was that the spirit of Apple would live on, the relentless pursuit of excellence, the belief that design and purpose could change the world. In the weeks that followed, his health worsened. He spent his days surrounded by family, his wife Lorene, and their children. They would sit in the quiet warmth of their home, listening to music, sharing moments of stillness. For a man who had spent his life racing toward the future, these slow, simple moments were his final revelation. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs took his last breath. He was 56 years old. The news spread across the globe in seconds, yet the world fell silent. In cities from San Francisco to Shanghai, candles were lit outside Apple stores. People left flowers, notes, and drawings of bitten apples glowing in the night. It wasn't mourning for a CEO. It was farewell to a man who had changed the rhythm of human life. Tim Cook, now Apple's leader, said simply, "Steve leaves behind a company only he could have built, and his spirit will forever be the foundation of Apple." The words echoed the truth everyone felt, that Steve Jobs was more than an innovator. He was a storyteller of the modern age. He didn't just create technology, he gave it meaning. Even in death, his influence continued to grow. The company he left behind carried on his philosophy, not to copy his style, but to honor his clarity. Every new iPhone, every elegant curve of glass, every seamless experience whispered the same message he had spent a lifetime teaching: think different. In time, Apple Park was completed. The shimmering ring of glass surrounded by trees, sunlight, and silence. It became more than a headquarters. It became a monument to a way of thinking, to a man who believed that even the smallest detail could hold infinite meaning. Visitors often said it felt peaceful there, almost spiritual. That was Steve's touch. Simplicity as sanctuary. His last years revealed something deeper than ambition: acceptance. Steve had once feared imperfection, chaos, and loss. But in the end, he learned that impermanence was part of creation. "We're born, we live, we die," he said once, "and in between we make something." For him, that something wasn't just Apple. It was a reminder that beauty, when born of intention, never truly fades. The world will always remember the products he built: the Macintosh, the iPhone, the iPad. But those were only reflections of something greater, a mind that saw the future before the rest of us could imagine it. His real invention wasn't a machine, it was a mindset. The belief that passion, focus, and simplicity could turn ordinary moments into extraordinary ones. Steve Jobs didn't just change technology. He changed how humanity sees itself in relation to it. He made us believe that design could speak, that innovation could feel, that even glass and metal could carry emotion. And in doing so, he gave the world a gift it will never forget, the courage to dream differently. Even now, when we touch the smooth screen of a device or watch the gentle glow of an Apple logo in the dark, we are touching the echo of his vision. A reminder that behind every innovation lies a question, whispered by a restless mind. What if it could be better? That question, and the quiet man who asked it, will live on forever. When we look back on the life of Steve Jobs, it's easy to see the milestones, the Macintosh, the iPhone, the iPad, each one a revolution in its own right. But if we look closer, beneath the headlines and the hardware, we find something more profound. His story wasn't just about invention. It was about transformation, of self, of purpose, and of how we connect with the world around us. Steve Jobs lived his life at the intersection of technology and art. To him, the circuit board and the canvas were no different. Both were tools for expression. Both could reveal truth. He believed that great design was the meeting point between logic and love, where engineering met empathy. In every product Apple made, you could feel that philosophy, the quiet pulse of humanity inside the machine. His journey reminds us that innovation doesn't begin with answers. It begins with questions. Questions like, why do things have to be this way? What if beauty mattered as much as function? What if technology could feel human? These were not questions of profit or performance. They were questions of purpose, and they changed everything. From his early days in the garage to his final years in the boardroom, Steve's greatest gift was clarity. He had the rare ability to strip away noise and see the essence of a problem. He once said, "Deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do." That belief, in focus, in subtraction, became the foundation of Apple's design language and perhaps the secret to his own brilliance. He also taught us that failure is not the end, but the beginning of depth. When he was forced out of Apple, he didn't collapse under the weight of rejection. He turned loss into renewal. Next and Pixar were born from that period, proof that creativity often grows best in the soil of struggle. His return to Apple wasn't a comeback. It was evolution. Through it all, he remained restless, not for wealth, but for meaning. He once said, "We're here to put a dent in the universe." To him, that wasn't arrogance. It was responsibility. He believed that each of us carries the power to shape something lasting, something that whispers beyond our lifetime. And that whisper, when guided by truth, can move the world. But Steve's story wasn't without shadow. He could be difficult, demanding, even cruel at times. His pursuit of perfection sometimes cost him relationships and peace. Yet within those flaws lived his humanity. The same intensity that made him harsh also made him extraordinary. He showed us that greatness often walks hand in hand with imperfection, and that what matters is how we refine that energy into purpose. In his later years, illness humbled him. It stripped away the layers of identity and left only the essence of who he was. A seeker. The man who once tried to control every detail learned at last to let go. He came to see that simplicity wasn't just a design principle. It was a philosophy for living. When you remove the unnecessary, what remains is what's real. His life also carries a quiet reminder about time. For all his achievements, Steve could never buy more of it. And yet, in the limited years he had, he lived more fully than most ever will. He used his time not to chase comfort, but to chase clarity. And that, perhaps, is his greatest lesson, that time should not be spent, it should be shaped. When he spoke at Stanford in 2005, his words captured the essence of his journey. Stay hungry, stay foolish. It wasn't advice to chase recklessly, but to remain curious, to keep the beginner's mind alive even in mastery, to hunger for meaning, to risk failure, to live fully awake. Those words, echoing through time, have inspired millions to dare differently. Steve's story also reminds us that technology at its best is not about power, it's about connection. The devices we hold today are not just tools, they are bridges between people, ideas, and generations. Through his vision, he made the digital world feel personal. He turned cold code into warmth, precision into poetry. In his final years, he spoke often about death, not with fear but with acceptance. He called it life's change agent. To him, death was not an ending but a clearing of space, a reminder that what we create, if built with love, endures. His life became a meditation on impermanence and on the quiet truth that beauty, like all things, fades, so that something new may rise. Even now, every Apple device carries a trace of his fingerprint, not in design, but in spirit. The elegance of simplicity, the insistence on quality, the courage to care about the unseen, each one is a vessel for his belief that technology should serve humanity, not replace it. And that belief continues to shape how we live, work, and dream. When we remember Steve Jobs, we don't just remember a businessman or an inventor. We remember a thinker, a poet of progress, a craftsman of clarity. We remember the boy who looked at the stars above Mountain View and wondered how things worked. The man who walked barefoot through Reed College searching for truth and simplicity. The visionary who stood on stage, frail but fearless, holding the future in his hand. His story is a mirror, reflecting not just his genius, but our own potential. It asks us to look within and ask, what am I building? What am I giving? What am I leaving behind? Because in the end, greatness isn't about how much you create, but how deeply you care. Steve once said, "We make tools that amplify human abilities." Perhaps his greatest tool was the example of his own life, a reminder that creativity, courage, and compassion are the true engines of progress. He didn't just teach us how to build better machines, he taught us how to build with meaning. And maybe that's the final lesson of Steve Jobs, that in a world obsessed with more, the most revolutionary act is to create with heart. To believe that simplicity is sacred, to remember that what we make becomes part of who we are. Because in the quiet hum of every Apple device, in the glow of every screen that connects us, there is a whisper, his whisper, reminding us to stay hungry, to stay foolish, and to never stop thinking differently. Years after Steve Jobs' passing, his presence still lingers, not in words or monuments, but in the quiet moments of everyday life. It's there when someone opens a sleek laptop and feels that perfect click of the hinge. It's there when a child touches a screen for the first time and discovers curiosity at their fingertips. It's there when design disappears and experience simply feels right. Steve Jobs may have left the world, but his philosophy never did. At Apple's headquarters in Cupertino, the circular glass walls of Apple Park shimmer under the California sun, a living reflection of his mind. Every line of its architecture speaks his language, simplicity, symmetry, and nature in harmony with innovation. The building was one of his last dreams, a space where creativity could breathe. Today, as teams of designers, engineers, and dreamers walk its hallways, they walk inside a vision he began decades ago, a vision that still evolves. Under Tim Cook's leadership, Apple has continued to grow, but always with the same quiet heartbeat of purpose. Each new product, from the Apple Watch to the MacBook Air, carries the echo of Steve's ideals: precision, empathy, and respect for beauty. The details remain sacred, corners still curve with intent, packaging still opens with care. The spirit of craftsmanship that Paul Jobs once taught his son still guides the company that bears his name. Yet Steve's legacy isn't confined to Apple. His influence reaches far beyond technology. into how we think, how we create, and how we live. He redefined the role of design in business, turning aesthetics into strategy and storytelling into innovation. Every startup that now obsesses over user experience, every company that strives for simplicity, owes a quiet debt to the man who proved that design is not decoration, it's destiny. Around the world, his story continues to inspire dreamers, not because he was perfect, but because he wasn't. He was flawed, emotional, demanding, and often misunderstood. But he was real, and in his rawness, he showed us that genius isn't about certainty, it's about curiosity, the courage to ask questions no one else dares to ask. In classrooms and boardrooms alike, people still quote his words. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Simple, yet timeless. It has become more than advice, it's a philosophy of living, a reminder that progress belongs not to those who play it safe, but to those who dare to dream recklessly. Steve didn't follow trends, he created them. He didn't chase success, he defined it by meaning. Even those who never met him feel connected to his spirit through the things he built. Millions carry iPhones in their pockets, not just tools, but symbols of human creativity. They are reminders that great ideas begin with empathy, not ego, that technology can serve the heart as much as the mind, and that the future belongs to those who believe simplicity can be sacred. At Pixar, the studio he once saved from obscurity, his influence also endures. Each animated film, from Toy Story to Inside Out, carries his belief that technology should serve storytelling, not overshadow it. The marriage of code and emotion, of algorithms and art, was his dream long before it became the standard of creativity. Through Pixar, Steve's philosophy continues to teach generations that imagination, when disciplined by purpose, can change the world. For the people who worked alongside him, his memory is personal, sometimes challenging, always unforgettable. Many recall the long nights, the impossible expectations, the bursts of brilliance that would light up a room. They remember how he could tear down an idea one moment and rebuild it into something extraordinary the next. To them, Steve wasn't just a boss. He was a force of nature, unpredictable, unstoppable, but always driven by love for what he created. Over time, the myth of Steve Jobs has grown. The visionary in the black turtleneck, the man who stood on stage and revealed the future with a single slide, but beyond the myth was a human being, one who laughed loudly, argued fiercely, and cared deeply. He wasn't trying to be iconic, he was simply trying to make something right. And in that pursuit, he found immortality. Apple's products continue to evolve, yet the essence remains the same: clean lines, honest materials, quiet intelligence, the philosophy of less, refined to perfection. When a new iPhone or MacBook is unveiled, the world still feels a spark of the same wonder that Steve once brought to every keynote. It's as if his spirit steps out from the shadows of memory to say, "We're not done yet." Beyond technology, his influence touches how people see creativity itself. He blurred the line between art and commerce, showing that beauty and business could coexist. He made design a language everyone could understand, a language that speaks directly to emotion. He showed us that great ideas don't start in boardrooms or spreadsheets, but in hearts that refuse to settle. For young creators, Steve Jobs remains a symbol of possibility. His journey from the garage to global fame is more than a success story. It's a map for those who dare to dream differently. He proved that rebellion can coexist with purpose, that idealism can coexist with reality, and that the impossible can be built one decision at a time. His life is a reminder that the future doesn't belong to those who wait for it. It belongs to those who build it. In every era, there are people who redefine what humanity means in their time. Da Vinci painted it, Einstein calculated it, Jobs designed it. His brush was technology, his canvas was the human experience. And what he painted was not just progress, but poetry. The the poetry of connection, of wonder, of meaning hidden in simplicity. Today, as the world continues to evolve, his vision remains a guiding light. Artificial intelligence, wearable devices, and virtual worlds all trace their lineage back to his belief that technology should serve human intuition. It just works, he used to say. And that phrase, so simple, so effortless, still defines what every innovator strives for. In the end, Steve Jobs' legacy is not a company, it's a consciousness. It's the belief that perfection is worth pursuing, that ideas are worth protecting, and that the world can still be shaped by imagination. He showed us that when you combine intellect with heart, work becomes art, and art, when born of love, becomes timeless. So perhaps the most fitting tribute to Steve Jobs isn't found in statues or museums, but in the small daily miracles his vision made possible. The swipe of a finger, the click of a button, the melody of connection across continents. His story reminds us that technology, when crafted with purpose, can feel almost divine. And as night falls over Cupertino, the lights at Apple Park glow softly against the horizon, a circle of glass reflecting stars and dreams alike. Somewhere in that glow we can almost hear his voice, calm and certain, whispering the same message that guided his entire life. Don't be afraid to think differently. Time has a way of softening memory, turning moments into symbols and people into legends. For Steve Jobs, that transformation was inevitable. Yet even now, beyond the mythology and the machines, his true legacy isn't trapped in history. It lives in motion, in silence, in the way we move through the digital world without even noticing how natural it feels. His dream was never just about screens. It was about what happens beyond them. Every day, billions of people reach for their devices before they speak a word, before they see another face. That instinct, that seamless connection, exists because one man once imagined technology that felt human. He wanted to erase the barrier between thought and action, between intention and creation. He wanted our tools to disappear so that only our imagination remained. And now, in ways almost invisible, his wish has come true. We live in the world Steve Jobs dreamed of, a world where design shapes behavior, where simplicity shapes understanding. When we swipe, tap, or speak to our devices, we are speaking his language. His obsession with elegance became our everyday ritual. His belief that technology should serve beauty became a quiet truth that governs how we live, work, and connect. But perhaps what makes his vision so enduring isn't what we hold in our hands. It's what it reminds us about ourselves. Steve saw potential in the human mind that most of us overlook. He believed that creativity was not a gift for the few, but a birthright for everyone. People with passion, he once said, can change the world for the better. And through the tools he built, he gave billions the means to do just that. Artists compose music on iPads. Filmmakers edit entire movies on MacBooks. Entrepreneurs build companies from their phones. Each of them, knowingly or not, is continuing the story Steve began, using technology not as a wall, but as a window. The devices he imagined have become instruments of creation, amplifying the human voice instead of replacing it. And yet, as technology grows more powerful, his teachings feel even more relevant. The world he foresaw is not without shadows: addiction, distraction, isolation. These are the unintended consequences of a connected world. But even here, Steve's voice echoes softly. Technology alone is not enough. He believed that progress without purpose was noise, and that the true measure of innovation is whether it makes life better. The people who carry his vision forward understand this balance. At Apple and beyond, the next generation of creators still ask the questions he taught them to ask. Why does this matter? Who does it help? How does it feel? They know that every line of code, every curve of glass, every sound and silence carries the power to change emotion. That was Steve's secret: empathy built into design. In many ways, he turned the world itself into his final canvas. Look around, and you'll see his fingerprints everywhere. In the clean interfaces of modern software, in the minimalist architecture of global cities, in the idea that innovation should be invisible and intuitive. The simplicity that once seemed radical has become the standard. His rebellion has become our reality. But beyond all this, beyond the devices, the designs, the dreams, lies something more subtle. Steve Jobs reminded us that creation is a moral act, that what we build should reflect who we are, that beauty and integrity are not luxuries, they are responsibilities. He often said that craftsmanship means caring about the unseen parts, the ones nobody else will notice. And in a world increasingly obsessed with speed, that belief stands as both a challenge and a prayer. When he spoke to young people, Steve rarely talked about wealth or fame. He spoke about curiosity, about following intuition even when logic disagrees. Don't be trapped by dogma, he told them. Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. It was the same wisdom that had guided him from his father's workshop to the heart of Silicon Valley, a faith in feeling, not formulas. That belief has quietly shaped an entire generation of thinkers. Many of today's most influential creators, from engineers to filmmakers, cite Steve not just as a mentor, but as a mirror. He showed them that art and business, creativity and logic could coexist. He showed them that meaning matters more than metrics, and that perhaps is his greatest innovation, turning ambition into art. For those who grew up with his inventions, his presence feels almost eternal. His voice, calm and deliberate, still narrates old keynotes played across YouTube screens at midnight. His smile, half playful, half knowing, still appears in the stories told by those who worked beside him, and every time a new product is revealed, his spirit feels close, not as a memory, but as momentum. To study Steve Jobs is to study the tension between control and surrender, between the urge to perfect and the wisdom to let go. His life was both a quest for mastery and a journey toward meaning, and in the end, he found both. Not in dominance, but in design, not in power, but in peace. He left behind more than a company. He left a compass, one that points toward clarity, purpose, and care. A reminder that innovation is not about racing ahead. It's about refining what already exists until it resonates with truth. In a world driven by distraction, that message feels almost revolutionary. Every generation produces a few minds who seem to see further, not because they have better vision, but because they look deeper. Steve Jobs was one of those minds. He didn't just predict the future, he invited us to participate in it. And though he's gone, his voice continues to guide the hands that build, the minds that imagine, and the hearts that dare to dream differently. So the next time you open your device, pause for a moment. Feel the weight of it, the simplicity, the balance, the silence between its motions. Know that it was built by countless people, inspired by one man's question: what if technology could be beautiful? That question continues to shape our world. It continues to shape us. Steve Jobs once said, "We are here to make a little noise in the universe," and he did. But the noise he made was not loud, it was melodic. It hums quietly beneath everything we now call progress. And as long as there are dreamers who believe in the marriage of art and reason, that melody will never fade. Because some legacies are not written in stone or code, they are written in feeling, in the calm simplicity of a world that, without him, would have been much noisier and far less beautiful. When people hear the word innovation, they often think of technology, of machines, algorithms, or futuristic visions that promise to change the world. But for Steve Jobs, innovation was never just about invention. It was about intuition, about seeing connections where others saw separation, about caring deeply enough to ask, why not? When the world kept saying, that's impossible, He believed that innovation wasn't born from complexity, it was born from simplicity. The ability to distill an idea to its essence, to strip away everything that doesn't matter until only truth remains. Simple can be harder than complex, he once said. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean. To him, simplicity wasn't minimalism, it was clarity. The moment when an idea becomes pure enough to touch the soul. Every great product that Apple created reflected that principle. The iPod wasn't just a music player, it was freedom in your pocket. The iPhone wasn't just a phone, it was a bridge to the world. The iPad wasn't just a tablet, it was a canvas waiting for imagination. Steve's genius lay not in making things new, but in making them inevitable. His designs felt so natural that it was hard to imagine life before them. Innovation, in his mind, wasn't about predicting the future. It was about creating it. He didn't follow data or trends, he followed instinct. He trusted what he called the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. He believed that real progress happens when creativity meets engineering, when emotion meets logic. That's why his products didn't just work. They felt right. They had a soul. But Steve also knew that innovation demanded courage. The courage to say no, to walk away from good ideas in pursuit of great ones, to start over, even when success seemed within reach. His career was filled with moments of rejection, failure, and doubt. Yet each time he returned stronger, sharper, more certain of his vision, because for him, innovation wasn't a single moment of genius. It was persistence, the art of never settling. He often compared innovation to art. A true artist, he said, isn't satisfied when something is good, only when it's right. He pushed his teams relentlessly because he believed they could do better. He once told them, "We're not here to make a profit, we're here to make a difference." That philosophy didn't just build Apple. It redefined the modern world's relationship with technology. The people who worked with him sometimes called it the reality distortion field. But it wasn't magic, it was conviction, a belief so strong that it pulled reality closer until it bent. Steve could see possibilities that others couldn't because he refused to be limited by what was. He lived in the space between imagination and action, where dreams take shape and ideas come alive. In today's world, the meaning of innovation often gets lost in noise, endless updates, faster chips, brighter screens. But if Steve were here, he might remind us that innovation isn't about speed or spectacle. It's about purpose. It's about making something that truly matters, something that improves life in small but profound ways, something built with care. He believed that every detail mattered, even the parts people would never see. The inside of a Mac was as beautiful as the outside because craftsmanship, he said, was a form of respect. It was a way of honoring both the creator and the user. That belief transformed not only how Apple designed, but how the world began to think about excellence. Steve once said that innovation comes from saying no to 1,000 things. That kind of restraint takes wisdom, the ability to see what's essential and let go of the rest. In an age that glorifies more, his legacy reminds us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is less. That elegance and restraint can speak louder than abundance. His approach to innovation was deeply human. He understood that technology should not distance people from life. It should bring them closer to it. He wanted his creations to feel like extensions of the human spirit. That's why when people use an Apple product, they don't just use it, they feel it. It becomes personal, familiar, alive. Innovation, to Steve, was empathy translated into design. He once said, "Design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works." That statement became a manifesto for an entire generation of creators. It taught them that beauty and function are not opposites. They are partners. When united, they can make technology feel like poetry. He saw innovation as a moral pursuit, one that required integrity and vision. It wasn't about being first, it was about being right. He rejected shortcuts and shallow praise, insisting that every creation must earn its place in the world. And when something wasn't perfect, he had the humility to start over, because he believed that what you build is a reflection of who you are. Today, long after his passing, those lessons still resonate. The most successful companies in the world echo his philosophies: simplicity, empathy, and focus. Young inventors study his keynotes like scripture, searching for the rhythm of his insight. And in every corner of the creative world, his spirit whispers the same reminder. Innovation is not about making things. It's about making things better. For Steve Jobs, the meaning of innovation wasn't measured in profits or market share. It was measured in impact and how deeply a product could touch someone's life. A song that sounded better, a call that felt clearer, a design that made someone smile. Those small, quiet improvements were his revolution, the invisible threads that tied humanity and technology together. He once described himself as a gardener, not a builder, not a boss, but someone who plants ideas and nurtures them until they bloom. That humility, hidden beneath his intensity, reveals the truth about his genius. He didn't just make products. He cultivated possibilities. He gave people tools to express who they were, to create, to connect, to dream. In the end, innovation for Steve Jobs was never about the machine. It was about the mind, the human capacity to imagine something better and bring it into being. He believed that the greatest innovation wasn't found in technology, but in the people who use it. That belief continues to ripple through time, shaping the way the world thinks, creates, and feels. And maybe that's the meaning of innovation, not to change what we have, but to reveal what we've forgotten. To remind us that creativity is a language we all speak, even if we've grown quiet. Steve Jobs didn't just teach us how to think differently. He taught us how to feel differently, how to look at the world and see possibility instead of limitation. Because true innovation doesn't end with invention, it ends with understanding. It's not about building the future, but about becoming it. And in that sense, Steve Jobs was never just an innovator. He was a translator, turning human longing into light, and light into something that could be held in the palm of your hand. If there was one principle that guided Steve Jobs through every triumph and failure, it was simplicity. To him, simplicity was not the absence of complexity. It was the mastery of it. It was the discipline to remove the unnecessary until only truth remained. Simple, he once said, can be harder than complex. And those words would define not just the products he built, but the philosophy he lived by. From his earliest days tinkering in the garage with Steve Wozniak, Steve understood that technology should not intimidate. It should invite. He hated clutter, confusion, and noise. He wanted elegance, balance, and purpose. Whether it was a device, a sentence, or a life, he believed everything could be improved by subtraction. His obsession with clarity wasn't about control. It was about connection. To Steve, simplicity wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a moral one. It reflected respect for the user, for the craftsman, and for the world itself. A simple design said, "I thought about you." It spoke in silence, through precision. It didn't need to shout because it already understood. That quiet confidence became the soul of every Apple creation. Not flashy, not loud, but perfectly in tune with human nature. In a world that celebrated excess, Steve's pursuit of simplicity felt revolutionary. He believed that focus was the ultimate form of sophistication. Deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do, he told his teams. And that wasn't just business advice. It was a philosophy for living. Simplicity, to him, was the art of saying no, with purpose. When he returned to Apple in 1997, the company was on the brink of collapse. Dozens of products filled the shelves, confusing, unfocused, lost. Steve took a marker, walked to a whiteboard, and drew a simple grid. "We're going to make 4 products," he said. "A consumer laptop, a pro laptop, a consumer desktop, and a pro desktop. That clarity saved Apple. It transformed chaos into vision. It proved that simplicity is not about doing less, it's about doing what matters. The design of Apple's products reflected this philosophy perfectly. One button instead of many, one cable instead of a tangle, one gesture that replaced dozens of commands. Each product was an invitation to peace, to a kind of technological stillness. When you picked up an iPhone or opened a MacBook, you didn't have to think. You could just be. That was Steve's gift, making the complex disappear. But his devotion to simplicity went beyond technology. It shaped his daily life. His signature black turtleneck, jeans, and sneakers were not a fashion statement. They were focus embodied. By removing unnecessary decisions, he freed his mind for creation. His home, sparse and serene, reflected the same principle. Every object had a purpose. Every detail mattered. His world was a meditation in form. Simplicity also guided how he thought about time. "Remembering that you are going to die," he once said, "is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose." In that realization, he found clarity. It stripped away fear, pride, and pretense. It left only what was essential, the need to create, to connect, to love. For Steve, simplicity wasn't just about design, it was about truth. In his conversations with designers like Jony Ive, he often spoke about honesty, not just visual honesty, but emotional honesty. A product, he said, should never pretend to be something it's not. It should reveal its function through its form. That belief became Apple's design DNA. Glass that looked like glass, metal that felt like metal, and interfaces so intuitive they needed no instruction. The beauty came not from decoration, but from integrity. But simplicity, Steve knew, required courage. It meant facing the fear of emptiness, the silence that follows when you remove everything that doesn't belong. Many people fill that silence with noise, with features, with distractions. Steve refused. He trusted that simplicity, when done right, would speak louder than any excess. And it did. The first iPhone launch, with its clean interface and single home button, wasn't just innovation. It was philosophy made physical. He once said that simplicity was the ultimate sophistication, but what he meant was even deeper. That simplicity is a reflection of self-understanding. When you know who you are, you don't need to prove it. When a design knows what it's meant to do, it doesn't need to impress. It simply works. That quiet confidence became Apple's identity and Steve's legacy. In the creative process, simplicity is often the hardest truth to reach. It demands letting go of ego, of habits, of fear. It demands patience, revision, humility. Steve was relentless in that pursuit. He would reject dozens of prototypes, sometimes for months, until something finally felt right. His instinct for simplicity wasn't learned. It was remembered. A return to something fundamental, the childlike sense of wonder that first drew him to design. To his teams, Steve's insistence on simplicity could feel extreme. He would spend hours debating the curve of a corner, the shade of a color, the click of a button. But behind that intensity was love. Love for craft, love for users, love for the experience of clarity. He once said, "Details matter, it's worth getting it right." That sentence was both instruction and prayer. Simplicity also shaped the way Steve saw leadership. He believed that great teams should be small, focused, and free to dream. He hated bureaucracy, meetings, and mediocrity. He preferred deep work over shallow coordination. To him, simplicity in management was about trust, finding people who care as much as you do, and then giving them space to create. His teams didn't just follow him, they believed with him. When he spoke about creativity, he often described it as connecting the dots, seeing patterns others miss. But to connect the dots, you first have to clear the noise. Simplicity is what makes connection possible. It allows intuition to breathe. It makes space for insight to appear. Without it, even genius becomes cluttered. As he faced his final years, Steve's understanding of simplicity deepened. Illness stripped away everything but the essential. He no longer had time for what didn't matter. In his last public appearances, his words grew softer, his tone gentler. He spoke not as a CEO, but as a human being reflecting on meaning. "Your time is limited," he told the world, "so don't waste it living someone else's life." It was simplicity, distilled into wisdom. The power of simplicity, as Steve lived it, is not just in what it removes, but in what it reveals. It reveals honesty, intention, and care. It reveals the essence of things, and in that essence, there is peace. Every Apple product, every story he told, carried that peace. It was his quiet rebellion against the chaos of modern life, a reminder that beauty doesn't demand attention. It earns it through grace. Even now, as technology races forward, Steve's philosophy stands as a compass. In a world that confuses progress with complexity, his voice reminds us to slow down, to refine, to breathe, to seek not what is new, but what is true. His life proved that simplicity isn't the end of design, it's the beginning of wisdom. Because when everything else fades, the trends, the noise, the headlines, what remains is clarity. And clarity in its purest form is love made visible. That was Steve Jobs' gift to the world. That was the power of simplicity. For Steve Jobs, creation was never a straight line. It was a circle, a constant flow of ideas, inspiration, and renewal. Every beginning was also an ending. Every success was a seed for something new. He believed that the act of creating was not about control, but about connection, the invisible thread that ties the human spirit to the universe itself. From his early years experimenting with calligraphy at Reed College to designing the first Macintosh, Steve felt that creativity was a form of energy. It moved through people, through objects, through time. "Creativity is just connecting things," he once said. But what he didn't say, though he lived it, was that those connections never end. They evolve, echo, and return. He often compared life to a tapestry. Each person adds their own thread, a color, a pattern, a small act of creation. When you step back far enough, you see how those threads intertwine to form something vast and beautiful. That's why he believed so deeply in craftsmanship. Every decision, no matter how small, was a contribution to the larger fabric of the world. To create carelessly was to weaken the weave. Steve's philosophy was influenced by his fascination with Zen Buddhism, the idea that simplicity and awareness lead to enlightenment. He often said that the best creations come when the mind is quiet, when ego steps aside and intuition takes over. In those moments, creation doesn't feel forced. It feels revealed. He approached design the same way, removing, refining, and returning to what felt pure. He once told a story about his father, Paul Jobs, who built fences so perfectly that even the unseen backsides were crafted with care. "You'll know," his father had said. That lesson stayed with Steve his entire life. He believed that true creation demanded integrity, not for recognition, but for respect. The unseen mattered because it reflected who you were when no one was watching. That was the heart of the circle, doing things right, so the energy of creation remained whole. At Apple, this philosophy became culture. Every product, every box, every line of code was part of a continuum. Engineers would say that when they built something great, they could feel Steve's presence, not as a ghost, but as a guide. His spirit lived in the questions he taught them to ask. Does it feel human? Does it bring joy? Is it honest? Each answer brought them closer to that invisible circle he believed in, where design met soul. But creation, Steve understood, also meant destruction. To create something new, something else must often end. Old ideas, old versions, old beliefs. He wasn't afraid of that. In fact, he saw it as necessary. He once said, "Death is very likely the single best invention of life." It clears the way for renewal. That understanding made him fearless in innovation, willing to abandon the past to make room for the future. When the iPod was at its peak, he introduced the iPhone, knowing it would make the iPod obsolete. Most companies would have hesitated. Steve did not. To him, that was the circle, creation consuming itself to be reborn. He didn't mourn what was lost. He celebrated what was learned. That rhythm of renewal is what kept Apple alive long after his passing. His belief in cycles extended beyond business. He saw it in nature, in art, in relationships. Everything, he believed, has a pulse, a rise, a fall, and a return. The key was to stay awake to that rhythm, to know when to build and when to let go, when to speak and when to listen. In that awareness, he found peace. As a leader, Steve often spoke about leaving the world better than you found it. But he didn't mean through grand gestures or charity. He meant through creation, through the quiet act of adding something meaningful to the world's circle. Whether it was a design, a song, or a line of code, he believed that every act of creation adds to the shared human story. "We all die," he said, "but if you've made something, it lives." That's why he saw Apple not as a company, but as an organism, alive, breathing, learning. It was part of a larger cycle that extended far beyond profit or products. To him, Apple was a reflection of human potential, proof that when people work with passion and integrity, they can shape reality itself. And even after his death, that energy continued to move, inspiring millions to create their own circles. In the years since his passing, the echoes of his philosophy can be felt everywhere. Designers speak of Jobsian clarity. Filmmakers reference his storytelling rhythm. Entrepreneurs quote his lines about focus and love. The circle continues, not in imitation, but in evolution. His ideas have merged with countless others, forming something new, something alive. That was always his goal, to start ripples that never end. But Steve also understood that creation required humility. He knew that no one truly owns an idea. We only borrow it, shape it, and pass it on. He often credited the people who came before him, the engineers of Xerox PARC who envisioned the graphical interface, the artists and musicians who taught him beauty. To him, innovation was not invention in isolation. It was participation in the ongoing conversation of humanity. He described it best when he said, "We're all just taking our turn." That sentence carried the wisdom of a man who understood the circle deeply. We are not here to dominate. We are here to contribute, to add our verse to the world's song. When you see creation that way, competition fades and meaning takes its place. The purpose of life becomes not to own, but to give. Even in his final months, Steve continued to create. He refined designs, mentored young leaders, and shaped Apple Park, a building designed in the image of a circle. It was no accident. The structure itself reflected his philosophy. Open, connected, endless. It was his final metaphor, his last masterpiece, a physical embodiment of his belief that creativity never truly ends. It only changes hands. When visitors walk through Apple Park today, they often describe a strange calm. The sunlight curves through glass walls, trees sway gently in the courtyard, and silence hums beneath the movement of innovation. It feels alive, not like a company, but like a sanctuary for ideas. Steve once said that Apple should be the intersection of technology and the humanities. Apple Park became the intersection of spirit and structure, the circle completed. The beauty of Steve Jobs' philosophy is that it doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to everyone who creates with love and purpose. Every designer who obsesses over details, every teacher who ignites curiosity, every dreamer who refuses to settle. Each one adds to the circle, carrying his spirit forward through action, not memory. And maybe that's the secret of creation, that what we give to the world, we never truly lose. It continues, transforms, and returns to inspire someone else. Steve Jobs may be gone, but his circle remains unbroken. It spins quietly in the hands of every person who dares to think differently, to care deeply, and to create something meaningful. Because creation, at its core, is not about making things. It's about becoming part of something greater, something timeless. And as long as humanity continues to dream, the circle will keep turning. Beneath the sleek glass, the polished aluminum, and the minimalist perfection of every Apple product, there was something invisible, something most companies never understood. It wasn't just engineering. It wasn't just design. It was feeling. Steve Jobs knew that the most powerful technology isn't built from metal and code. It's built from empathy. He often said that computers were the most remarkable tool we've ever come up with. But he also warned that tools alone weren't enough. What mattered was how those tools made people feel. Every product had to begin with the user, their hopes, their frustrations, their sense of wonder. You've got to start with the customer experience, he said, and work backward to the technology. That single sentence became the foundation of everything Apple created. To Steve, emotion was not an afterthought. It was the blueprint. When he designed a product, he didn't think in features. He thought in moments. He wanted someone to open a box and feel curiosity, to touch a screen and feel delight, to use a device and feel empowered. That was his secret. He built emotions, not electronics. And through those emotions, he built connection. The human element guided every decision. When Apple was designing the first iPhone, Steve obsessed over the way it felt in the hand, its weight, its edges, the gentle glow of the screen. He knew that the human hand and mind were sensitive to even the smallest imperfections. If something felt wrong, it broke trust. So he demanded harmony between function and form, between what we touch and what touches us. He saw design as a form of empathy, the act of understanding someone so well that you can anticipate what they need before they ask. He didn't just want technology that worked, he wanted technology that cared. When he watched people struggle with clunky menus or cold interfaces, he saw more than inefficiency, he saw alienation. He wanted technology to feel human again. In a sense, Steve Jobs was not building machines, he was building mirrors. He wanted people to see themselves reflected in their devices, not as users, but as creators. The Macintosh was not just a tool for computing, it was a canvas for imagination. The iPhone was not just a phone, it was a window to life. The iPad was not just a screen, it was an open field for curiosity. Each invention, in its own way, said, "You can create too." His fascination with the human mind went beyond technology. He studied psychology, design, and art, anything that could reveal what moves people. He believed that innovation required empathy because empathy connects logic to emotion, structure to soul. Without it, technology becomes hollow. But when empathy guides it, technology becomes art. Many of his colleagues remember how deeply he cared about experience. He would sit silently in meetings, eyes fixed on a prototype, feeling rather than analyzing. After a long pause, he might simply say, "It doesn't feel right." He couldn't always explain why, but when it did feel right, everyone knew. The room would light up with the same quiet joy he was chasing, the moment when human emotion and design aligned perfectly. He believed that great technology disappears. It doesn't demand attention, it gives it. It allows people to focus on their work, their art, their lives, not on the machine itself. That's why he hated unnecessary buttons, cluttered screens, and bloated menus. He wanted the human experience to be seamless, fluid, and kind. Technology to him should whisper, not shout. His understanding of emotion also shaped how he communicated. His product launches weren't presentations, they were performances. The lighting, the silence, the pacing, all designed to make people feel. When he unveiled the first iPhone in 2007, he didn't just show a device. He told a story. He built anticipation, surprise, and wonder. The world didn't just see innovation that day, it felt it. Behind that mastery of storytelling was something deeper, his ability to translate emotion into vision. He understood that people don't remember features, they remember how something made them feel. That's why every Apple product began with empathy, not ambition. It wasn't about being the first or the fastest. It was about being the most human. Steve's fascination with the human element also shaped his view of leadership. He believed that great teams weren't built on talent alone, they were built on shared emotion, passion, belief, purpose. The only way to do great work is to love what you do, he said. He wanted people who felt deeply, who cared beyond reason. He didn't want employees, he wanted believers. And yet, that depth of emotion made him difficult at times. He could be mercurial, intense, even harsh. But underneath the fire was always feeling. He pushed people not out of ego but out of devotion to the work, to the craft, to the user. He wanted every product to carry sincerity because he knew sincerity could be felt. In a world of noise, authenticity is music. That's what made Apple different. Competitors sold specifications, faster processors, higher resolutions, bigger storage. Apple sold feelings, joy, confidence, belonging. When someone held an Apple device, they didn't just own it, they experienced it. And in that moment, they felt seen, understood, human. That connection became the company's greatest achievement. The human element also defined how Steve thought about mortality. As his health declined, he spoke often about the fragility of life, about how everything we create carries a piece of who we are. Remembering that you are going to die, he said, is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. For him, that awareness wasn't morbid. It was freeing. It made every act of creation sacred. He once said that death is life's greatest invention. It clears the old to make way for the new. That belief came from his understanding of empathy. He knew that life, like design, is meaningful because it ends. That's what gives it shape, urgency, and beauty. The awareness of impermanence sharpened his love for simplicity, for purpose, for truth. It made him human, profoundly, beautifully human. Even now, his influence continues not through the devices he built, but through the emotions they inspire. Every time someone FaceTimes a loved one, captures a memory, or writes a song on a MacBook, they are participating in his vision, a world where technology connects us, not isolates us. That was his ultimate dream, a digital world that felt alive with emotion. Steve Jobs didn't just change how we interact with machines, he changed how machines interact with us. He gave technology a heartbeat. He made the artificial feel authentic. And in doing so, he reminded us that innovation without humanity is hollow. But when guided by empathy, it becomes eternal. The human element was, and always will be, the invisible thread running through his legacy. It's what made his work timeless, his vision spiritual, and his creations alive. Because in every product, every story, every design, there was always one quiet message, whispered through pixels and light. Technology is not about machines, it's about people. Time moves forward, but wisdom echoes. The story of Steve Jobs is not just a history of technology, it's a guidebook for dreamers, a map for anyone who dares to think differently, to walk a path that doesn't yet exist. For the next generation, his life stands as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that greatness begins not with genius, but with courage. Steve Jobs never claimed to have all the answers. What he had was curiosity, a restless hunger to explore the unknown. That hunger drove him to question everything. Why are computers ugly? Why can't design feel spiritual? Why do we accept limitations simply because they're familiar? His questions didn't just lead to products. they led to revolutions. The first lesson he left behind is simple. Stay curious. Curiosity is the spark that turns the ordinary into the extraordinary. Steve's genius wasn't in knowing, it was in wondering. He asked better questions than anyone else, and he refused to stop until the answers revealed something beautiful. For young creators, that is the first step. Never let comfort replace curiosity. The second lesson is focus. Steve often said that innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. In a world filled with noise, focus is power. It's the discipline to choose meaning over motion, clarity over chaos. When he returned to Apple in 1997, he simplified everything, from the product line to the company's mission. He didn't do more. He did less, better. That clarity is what brought Apple back to life. The third lesson is trust your intuition. Steve believed that data could inform you, but it could never lead you. Intuition, he said, is more powerful than intellect. He trusted his gut, not because it was mystical, but because it was deeply human. He understood that creativity flows from the heart first and logic second. And when you align the two, you create something the world has never seen. The fourth lesson is embrace failure. Steve's life was marked by rejection, from being fired from Apple to watching his ideas dismissed as impossible. Yet he never saw failure as defeat. He saw it as discovery. Sometimes life hits you in the head with a brick, he said, but don't lose faith. For him, failure was not the opposite of success. It was the foundation of it. The fifth lesson is connect art and technology. Steve believed the greatest innovations happen when creativity meets engineering. He stood at the intersection of design and science, where emotion gives logic a heartbeat. That's why his products weren't just functional, they were soulful. He showed that beauty is not a luxury in technology, it's a necessity, because beauty inspires care, and care inspires excellence. The sixth lesson is make things that matter. Steve once said, "We're here to put a dent in the universe." To him, work was never about money or fame. It was about impact. He measured success not by what he earned, but by what he gave, by how deeply his creations touched people's lives. He wanted to make things that would outlast him, and he did. The seventh lesson is listen to your heart. Throughout his life, Steve followed his inner voice, even when it led him away from convention. He dropped out of college not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. He knew his time was too precious to waste on paths that didn't feel true. That courage to listen inward, to trust the quiet signal beneath the noise, became his compass through every storm. The eighth lesson is never stop learning. Steve remained a student until his last breath. He studied art, music, history, and spirituality with the same intensity that others studied profit. He believed that creativity came from life itself, from seeing, feeling, and exploring without boundaries. The next generation, he believed, should never specialize too early. A broad understanding, he said, lets you see the patterns that others miss. The ninth lesson is build with love. Every corner of every Apple product carries this truth. Steve believed that love was not a soft concept. It was precision, patience, and pride in your work. He taught his teams that craftsmanship is an act of love. If you care about something, you'll go the extra mile to make it right. That love is what people feel every time they hold an Apple device, even if they can't name it. The 10th lesson is remember death. To Steve, mortality was not a source of fear. It was a source of focus. It reminded him that time is the only resource we can't replace. In his famous Stanford speech, he said, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life." That lesson continues to resonate across generations. It reminds us that the clock is always ticking, not to pressure us, but to awaken us. Beyond these lessons, Steve Jobs left a deeper message. that creativity is not the privilege of the few, but the responsibility of all. Every person has the capacity to create, to shape, to contribute. Whether it's a line of code, a melody, a sketch, or a simple act of kindness, creation is the way we leave our fingerprint on time. He also warned against the illusion of perfection. Steve's life was filled with contradictions, brilliance and stubbornness, inspiration and imperfection. But that complexity made him real. He showed that you can chase perfection without pretending to be perfect, that you can hold high standards and still remain human. For the next generation, that balance is the hardest and most important lesson to learn. He believed that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. And as the world becomes more digital, his wisdom becomes more urgent. Machines will become smarter, faster, and more capable. But what they will never have is feeling. That is the human advantage: empathy, intuition, emotion. The next generation must guard these qualities fiercely, for they are the source of true innovation. Steve also taught that the most valuable asset in life is not money, it's time. He lived fast, created endlessly, and faced death knowing he had given everything he could. The lesson is simple, but profound. Use your time to create meaning. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for the perfect moment. The perfect moment is now. His story teaches young dreamers that legacy isn't built overnight. It's built one decision at a time, in courage, in honesty, in care. It's built in how you treat people, how you chase ideas, and how you refuse to give up when the world doubts you. Legacy isn't something you leave behind. It's something you build every day. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: stay hungry, stay foolish. Those 4 words, spoken decades ago, still echo like a quiet prayer to creators everywhere. To stay hungry means to never stop reaching. To stay foolish means to never stop believing. Together, they form the rhythm of all progress: ambition with wonder, intelligence with humility, creation with care. For the next generation, Steve Jobs remains more than a figure in history. He is a mirror, reflecting what's possible when passion meets purpose. His story reminds us that the greatest technology is not in our devices, but in ourselves, that within each of us lies the power to imagine, to create, to inspire. And as time moves on, his lessons will continue to guide the hands that build the future. Because in the end, what Steve Jobs gave us wasn't just innovation. He gave us a way to see, to look at the world and whisper, "It can be better." Long after Steve Jobs left the world, the pulse of his creativity continues to echo. It hums quietly through the circuits of every device, through the classrooms of young dreamers, through the studios and garages where new ideas are born. Innovation, as he defined it, was never a moment in time. It was a spirit, a way of seeing, feeling, and believing that the world can always be reimagined. The spirit of innovation begins with curiosity. Steve never stopped asking why and what if. Those questions, simple yet profound, are the foundation of every great leap forward. He taught that innovation doesn't start with technology, it starts with empathy. To create something truly new, you first have to care enough to understand what people need, even if they can't yet describe it. That caring is where all progress begins. He often said that innovation is born at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts, where logic meets emotion, where science meets story. That belief has become the invisible engine of modern creativity. From Silicon Valley startups to art schools around the world, young creators still follow that path, blending art with engineering, code with compassion, and data with dreams. Steve's influence can be seen in every field that values both function and feeling, in architecture that prioritizes simplicity, in apps that put design before distraction, in classrooms where teachers encourage students to create, not just consume. The world learned from him that innovation is not about replacing the human touch. It's about extending it. When we look at today's technology, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and the expanding digital frontier, we can still trace the fingerprints of his philosophy. He believed that technology should dissolve barriers, not build them. It should empower, not overwhelm. It should make the human experience richer, not more mechanical. The true measure of innovation, he said, is whether it makes life better. The spirit he left behind continues to inspire a generation of thinkers who understand that progress without purpose is hollow. They build with care, with curiosity, and with the same love of detail that guided him. Many of them never met Steve Jobs, yet they feel his presence in every act of creation, in the way they refine, simplify, and dare to think differently. His voice lives in their work, soft but steady, reminding them to aim not for fame, but for meaning. He taught that innovation requires rebellion, not against authority, but against complacency. Don't be trapped by dogma, he once said. Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. That courage is what defines the true innovator. It's not the ability to invent, but the willingness to imagine a better world, and then build it piece by piece, no matter how impossible it seems. In many ways, the world has become what he envisioned, deeply connected, beautifully designed, intuitively digital. Yet even now his philosophy serves as a compass for where to go next. As technology grows more complex, the challenge is not to innovate faster, but to innovate wiser. Steve's voice still reminds us that simplicity and empathy are not opposites of progress. They are its soul. The spirit of innovation that Steve embodied is also a form of generosity. It's the belief that ideas are meant to be shared, not hoarded. He didn't invent the graphical interface, he improved it. He didn't create the smartphone, he reimagined it. Innovation, to him, was collaboration across generations. He often said that creativity is about connecting dots, but those dots include people, moments, and memories. His energy can still be felt in the culture of Apple, where teams continue to blend design and humanity. But it also extends far beyond, into companies, universities, and even individuals who adopt his mindset. The Jobsian philosophy has become a universal language of innovation. Care deeply, think clearly, and never stop refining. That mindset continues to shape the way we work, create, and dream. In art, we see it in minimalism, the return to essentials. In music, we see it in clarity, the silence between sounds. In technology, we see it in seamlessness, where effort disappears and experience flows. All of these carry Steve's imprint, whether consciously or not. He showed the world that innovation is not about adding more. It's about revealing what's already there, hidden beneath layers of noise. The next generation of innovators faces a different challenge. They live in a world overflowing with tools and possibilities where information moves faster than reflection. Steve's legacy reminds them to pause, to listen, to remember that creativity is not speed, it's depth, that innovation is not measured in updates but in understanding, that progress is not a race but a rhythm. His life also teaches a paradox that every creator must face. The closer you get to perfection, the more you realize it doesn't exist. Steve understood this deeply. That's why he never stopped improving, even when his products were already masterpieces. He saw creation as an ongoing dialogue between the possible and the ideal. Every breakthrough was just another question waiting to be asked. When you think about the devices that define our era, the iPhone, the MacBook, the iPad, they are not just tools. They are embodiments of his philosophy, elegant, intuitive, human. But their true power lies not in what they can do, but in what they allow us to do. They give people the power to create music, design art, tell stories, build companies, and connect with others. That was Steve's greatest dream, to give creation back to the Creator. The spirit of innovation is not about control, it's about liberation. It's the freedom to express, to explore, to fail, and to begin again. Steve Jobs believed that innovation flourishes when people are trusted to dream. He created environments where ideas could collide, where perfection wasn't demanded but discovered. He knew that creativity can't be managed. It can only be inspired. Even now, as new technologies emerge, artificial intelligence, robotics, and virtual reality, his lessons continue to whisper through them. It's not about the technology, he might say. It's about what the technology makes possible. He would remind us that the greatest innovations will always be the ones that serve the heart as much as the mind. And maybe that's the essence of Steve Jobs' spirit, the belief that innovation is not about things, but about people. It's about awakening something inside us, the courage to imagine, the patience to build, and the grace to care. His legacy is not static, it's alive, growing with every person who decides that good enough isn't good enough, that beauty still matters, that simplicity still inspires, that humanity still leads. The spirit of innovation, as Steve lived it, is timeless. It cannot die because it was never a product. It was a way of being, a belief that imagination, guided by empathy, can still change the world. And as long as people continue to ask questions, continue to seek truth, and continue to dream beyond the possible, his spirit will remain, quietly guiding them forward. Because the true gift Steve Jobs left behind is not technology. It's a spark, the kind that lives in every heart brave enough to dream. As the sun set on his final days, Steve Jobs found himself surrounded not by machines but by people, his family, his creations, his reflections. The man who once raced time now moved gently with it. His body weakened, but his mind remained awake, still curious, still reaching for the future. In the quiet moments, he seemed less like a CEO and more like what he had always been, a dreamer, chasing light. He had spent his life building things that lived beyond him, ideas that breathed, devices that spoke, designs that felt alive. But as he faced the end, he began to see that his true work was never just Apple or Pixar. It was something deeper, something invisible. He had been shaping not just technology, but consciousness, teaching the world to see with new eyes, to think differently, to believe that art and logic could coexist in harmony. Friends who visited him in those final weeks often described a calm radiance in his presence. He spoke softly about his journey, not of profits or milestones, but of lessons. He talked about love, about family, about simplicity. The man who once lived in intensity now spoke in stillness. He had spent his life seeking perfection, only to realize that perfection was simply presence, being fully alive in the moment that is. To those who knew him, Steve's last transformation was not one of resignation, but of realization. He came to understand that the same curiosity that drove him to build machines also drove him to understand life itself. He often said, "We're here to make a little noise in the universe." But in the end, he discovered that the universe had been making noise through him all along. He reflected on his childhood, on the nights in the garage with his father, on the smell of sawdust and solder, on the joy of creating something from nothing. That was where the dream began, not in ambition, but in wonder. And perhaps in those quiet days, he finally returned to that child, the boy who looked at the stars above Mountain View and whispered, "What if?" His life had come full circle, from curiosity to mastery, from control to surrender. In that circle, he saw the beauty of creation itself, that everything we make eventually becomes part of something greater. The Macintosh, the iPhone, the Pixar films. They were not endings, but extensions of the same dream, to make the world a little more human, a little more beautiful, a little more awake. As he reflected on death, Steve did not fear it. He called it life's change agent. To him, death was not an erasure, but a renewal, a handoff in the cycle of creation. It clears the old to make way for the new, just as technology replaces itself and ideas evolve into their next form. In that way, Steve saw himself not as an end, but as a beginning, one voice in the endless conversation between humanity and possibility. His family later shared that some of his final words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." 3 quiet breaths that carried the same awe that had guided his entire life. No one knows exactly what he saw in that moment. Perhaps it was peace, perhaps wonder, perhaps the continuation of the dream. But in those words, you can hear the essence of Steve Jobs, the man who never stopped being amazed by life. The world mourned his passing not just because of what he built, but because of what he represented, the courage to follow one's vision, no matter the cost. To millions, he was more than a businessman. He was a symbol of what human imagination could achieve when driven by love instead of fear. His story reminded the world that even in an age of machines, it is still the human spirit that defines progress. Years later, his influence continues to shape the world quietly. Each time a designer chooses clarity over clutter, Steve's spirit nods. Each time a creator risks everything for an idea, his legacy breathes again. Innovation, after all, is not a monument, it's a movement. And as long as people continue to dream, the dreamer never truly dies. His life also carries a deeper truth, that creation is not about making things last forever, but about giving others the courage to create. The artists, engineers, filmmakers, and thinkers inspired by him now carry that flame. They build, they fail, they learn, just as he did. In their work, in their belief, his presence remains. The circle of creation turns again. What made Steve Jobs different was not his intellect, but his heart. Beneath his intensity was a profound tenderness, a longing for beauty, for meaning, for connection. He once said, "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." But what he didn't say is that changing the world starts by caring deeply about every detail, every decision, every moment. His life was proof that care is the most revolutionary act of all. He showed the world that technology could have a soul, that business could have purpose, that art could live inside the everyday. His work became a bridge between the tangible and the spiritual, between precision and poetry. And even now, that bridge remains, connecting hearts and hands across generations. There is a quiet scene many remember from his Stanford speech, where Steve pauses, looks down, and says, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." In that moment, he wasn't just giving advice. He was passing the torch. He was reminding us that hunger keeps the spirit alive, the hunger to learn, to create, to wonder. And foolishness, that sacred innocence, keeps us human. It keeps us dreaming even when the world says we shouldn't. In truth, Steve Jobs never stopped dreaming. He just changed mediums. The dreams that once lived in machines now live in people. They live in every child who picks up a tablet and starts to draw, in every innovator who dares to simplify, in every thinker who sees beauty where others see rules. That's the magic of a true visionary. Their dreams become everyone's inheritance. And maybe that is what it means to be eternal, not to live forever, but to live in the hearts of others. Steve Jobs doesn't exist now as a man, but as a movement, a quiet, continuous whisper that says, you can create too. His story is not finished because creation never ends. The circle turns, the light continues. As we look around at the world he helped shape, we realize that his vision was never about technology. It was about transcendence. It was about the human desire to reach for something higher, to turn imagination into form and form into feeling. That desire lives in all of us. It is the same fire that burned in him. So when you open your device or start your own dream, remember the man who once stood barefoot in a college classroom, staring at letters, and saw beauty. Remember the man who faced failure and saw opportunity. Remember the man who faced death and saw wonder. Because Steve Jobs was above all a reminder that even in a world of logic, the dreamer still matters, and as long as we continue to dream, so does he. When we reach the end of a story like this, it's easy to think it's over. But stories like Steve Jobs's don't really end. They unfold in the quiet spaces of our own lives. In the moments when we stare at a blank screen, uncertain where to begin. In the nights when we wonder if our ideas matter. In the choices we make when no one is watching. His story doesn't close. It continues. Through us. Steve Jobs taught us that creation is not reserved for the chosen few. It belongs to anyone brave enough to care, anyone willing to fail, to question, to begin again. He showed us that beauty can exist in logic, and that simplicity is a form of love. Every product he made, every risk he took, every dream he chased, they were all reminders of one simple truth, that to create is to be alive. He believed that the human spirit is at its best when it's curious, that the desire to build, to improve, to understand is what connects us all. And perhaps that is why his legacy feels so personal. It isn't made of code or design. It's made of feeling. His work reminds us that technology, when guided by empathy, can bring people closer, not apart. There's something profoundly human about that. In a world that moves faster every year, Steve's lessons whisper the opposite. Slow down, pay attention, care about the details, find clarity, not clutter, meaning not noise. He believed that what we build should reflect what we value. And if we value compassion, precision, and beauty, our creations will carry those things long after we're gone. The story of Steve Jobs isn't about computers. It's about consciousness, about what happens when creativity meets conviction, when the mind and the heart work together instead of apart. It's about the courage to see the world not as it is, but as it could be, and then, step by step, to build that vision into reality. He once said that we all leave a ripple in the universe. That ripple doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be large. It just needs to be real. Every act of care, every pursuit of excellence, every spark of imagination adds to that ripple. And when combined, they form the current that carries humanity forward. So as we close this story, remember this. The next innovation doesn't have to come from Silicon Valley. It can come from your kitchen table, your notebook, your moment of stillness. It can come from a question you haven't asked yet. Steve Jobs' life reminds us that progress begins with a question and the courage to follow it. He taught us to stay hungry, not for success, but for truth. To stay foolish, not in ignorance, but in wonder. Those words aren't instructions. They're invitations. Invitations to live curiously, to love deeply, to create sincerely. They remind us that wisdom is not found in knowing, but in exploring, again and again. The world today hums with his influence. Every time you unlock your phone, every time you design, write, share, or dream, a small part of his vision lives on. But beyond the technology, beyond the glass and steel, his real legacy is the reminder that creation, at its heart, is an act of hope. And maybe that's what this story truly is. A love letter to hope. The kind that asks us to keep imagining, to keep building, to keep believing that what we make can make a difference. Steve Jobs' story tells us that even in a world of logic and machines, the most powerful force will always be the human spirit. So tonight, as the world grows quiet, let his story rest in you. Let it remind you that every thought you have, every dream you hold, is a possibility waiting to be shaped. You don't have to change the world. You only have to touch it honestly, beautifully, completely. Because that is how all great things begin, not with noise, not with perfection, but with one quiet thought, followed by the courage to begin. And somewhere in the silence beyond the stars, the eternal dreamer smiles, knowing the dream continues,